That looks like maybe it's, it says no source. And I'm not showing that I'm.
John, are the paper clip ones over here the same thing?
They're the same thing. They're extras. I printed those out and the numbers got on the wrong side because something happened in the printing. So I brought them just in case we ran out. Yeah.
We did it one time, yeah, in that cul-de-sac, yeah.
I know that's.
That would, yeah, that would be fine. All right, everyone, let's get started. Sorry for the delay. We're like 4 minutes late. I apologize for that. We've got a couple of people who are online, so thanks for joining us. And if you have questions when we get to the question and answer time, you can type those into the chat bar right-hand side of YouTube. So it is good to be here. It's been a journey. Oh, I'm like, what is that sound? Man, that was annoying. Holy cow, that voice. Oh, man. So we are live streaming this just in case you don't realize that. But also, if you would like to go back on and see the presentation or share it, you can get that on the Rocky Mountain Church Network YouTube channel. So there may be something that's a benefit. You may decide that it's something that you want to use with your leadership. If you go to the presentation website, the project website, which I will show a link at the end of the presentation today, there's all sorts of resources that are there. There's the devotional that we wrote to help understand mission and how mission and unity are tied together. There are the presentation notebook, which if you did not get one, you can grab one from the table over there. There's a notebook and sign-in sheet. That notebook is on there. Also, in your presentation notebook, there are several quotes that I use. There are different quotes that are coming out of my notes. Just to make sure that we covered everything, there's a book list that's on that project website, the books that I used for the presentation today. If you're interested in picking one of those up, there are some really, really great resources that I read through and that have informed some of what we're talking about today. As we look at the day, some of my hope is to kind of lay the groundwork for where we are. To look at the results of the survey, because there was some really interesting data that came out from that survey about our churches, our congregations, our pastors, our church leadership groups, and then to give a potential strategy for moving forward. Some of those resources are in your presentation notebook. There will be more that will be available. The last resource that will be up, if you are interested, there are actually two. One is probably by Friday, I will have a 3-week sermon series. That not tomorrow, a week from tomorrow, a 3-sermon series on unity and mission and how those two go together. Really tied in with what the devotional is. And so if you wanted, you could do those preaching series and then use the devotional in your congregation. That's totally up to you. And then the last resource is one of the final pages in your presentation notebook. It's also on the project website, is a unity covenant. That if you feel like you want to gather your church together, spend an evening in prayer, and then commit to unity and commit to continue to pray for unity, that's a resource you may find useful. I'm going to pray for us, and then we'll dive in. We'll get to work as we think about E Pluribus Una Ecclesia, out of many, one church, and how we can be united, even in the midst of having diverse ideologies. God, thank you so much for blessing us, for calling us into a relationship with yourself, and then entrusting us with the incredible responsibility of carrying your message, of fulfilling our mission, of glorifying you through fulfilling the Great Commission, and specifically the Great Commission's charge to make disciples. Father, we recognize that to one degree or another, we have all experienced disunity in our congregations, in the things that we have faced, in our interactions with people. God, I pray that you would use the thoughts of today, the thoughts of research, the thoughts that you have laid upon my heart to help us to navigate these tricky situations more effectively. Not so that we could have less stress, although that may be a side result, but so that our churches are more equipped and more ready to glorify you through fulfilling your commands. In Jesus' name, amen. We live in a contentious time. I'm not saying anything that is surprising to any of you. Politics and ideology have divided culture in probably way too many ways to be able to count. Unfortunately, that division has crept into the church as well. And as I say that, I think crept may not be an apt description. In a lot of cases, it has jumped full force into it. I know that because I was a pastor during COVID. I pastored Redding Christian Fellowship in Redding, California, a far northern part of California. A beautiful spot. We love our church. We love our congregation. We're still close with a lot of people who are there. The guy who now is the senior pastor was the high school pastor while we were there. We're still friends. Had lunch with him in November because his brother lives about half an hour from us and they were visiting. So really, really close relationship with people there. But COVID for us was really difficult. And it was difficult for several reasons. One, we were a church in California. And everything that you hear about California is 100% true. And I can probably tell you some things that would shock you beyond that. But then you stack on top of that, we were in Shasta County, California, which is rabidly conservative. Like the anti-government side of libertarian. And trying to navigate that situation in what we saw as a biblical manner, balancing maybe Romans 13, Titus 3, 1 Peter 3, a few things Jesus says, with Hebrews 10, that the church should be gathering together. Navigating that balance, quite honestly, tore me apart. It was by far the hardest thing I've ever done in ministry. Opening my email inbox and seeing an email from someone in our church accusing me of, quote, bending my knee to a corrupt government. Having someone in an email say that I was sinning by promulgating a lie, by saying that if you wore a mask, it helped protect other people. By being told that I had a weak reading of Romans 13. What made that extra difficult was those last two things came from an elder. Then I have a staff person who literally told me, John, the most dangerous thing I do all week is come to church. Trying to balance and navigate those situations, quite honestly, like I said, just about tore me apart. It was the hardest thing that I've done in ministry. And it was very discouraging to see the same rancor and division that we saw in culture happening within our congregation. And so at times I would stop and I would ask myself, how did we get here? How did we actually get to this point? And as I have done some reading and thought through kind of my experience, listened to other people's experiences, I think you can see an arc that has happened. It all started in culture, which is clearly divided. Jonathan Lehman wrote that Pew Research shows that Democrats are more left-leaning and Republicans more right-leaning than they were 2 decades ago. And both increasingly see each other as an existential threat to the nation. And so we are seeing a divide in culture that is pushing us further and further apart. Republican versus Democrat, conservative versus liberal, more further and further and further apart. Ideology has become so foundational that people have become entrenched and immovable. And when that happens, dialogue becomes impossible. And you see that over and over in culture. But as people rescued by the power and sin and death, by the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, a group of believers should look different than the divided culture around them. But we see that ideology has taken root so deeply that it seems like nothing else matters. Ed Stetzer wrote, many people are willing to create their own reality to affirm their righteousness, ignoring facts, logic, and others' objections. Stetzer in the same book wrote, outrage doesn't care about facts. And you feel like you have this really good conversation and it doesn't matter at all because outrage doesn't care about facts. We become entrenched in our ideology. And again, it should be different in the church. An author named Stanley Hauerwas, a fabulous book, wrote, what matters, therefore, is the reality of the interdependence, the unity, the depending upon one another that gives visibility to our Catholicity. The form, that is the institutional arrangement that expresses our interdependence, is valuable, but secondary. What is crucial is the effectiveness of how the gospel is lived out so that the gift and grace of God are apparent by the very fact that such a people exist. So as a church, the very unity that we should have, if we will live that out, it gives testimony to the fact that God exists. And it gives testimony to the fact that God is a reconciling God. That God is about the business of bringing things together. He's about the business of reconciling sinners to himself, of sinners to sinners, and even ultimately sinners to creation. That he reconciles all things in Christ. And when we have unity, we attest to that fact. And when we have unity, the difference from divided culture, that difference empowers the people of God, empowers the church to do what God calls it to do. Christina Cleveland wrote, from the very beginning, divisions have threatened the mission of the church. But it is also evident that from the very beginning, followers of Christ have demonstrated that they can overcome divisions in order to preserve and strengthen the mission of the church. We'll see this really clearly. We'll have a section where we talk about some biblical foundations, and we see this really clearly in Jesus' prayer. So, we should be different. That difference empowers our mission, but often we are not different from culture. Unfortunately, conflict exists in the church just as it does in the world because it is easy. This is going to be a thought that we come back to time and again. It is easy to confuse ideology for spirituality. It's easy to confuse ideology for theology. And there's some very clear reasons, which are fascinating, as to why that is. So again, we will come back to it. It's easy for us to mistake it. And when we mistake it, we think that we're acting on spirituality, but really we're acting out of our ideology. And when we act on our ideology, differences, divisions, disunity is the result. Stetzer wrote, by simply categorizing, we often create subcategories that detract from the more important, all-inclusive category of the body of Christ. Before you know it, whether people are pro-life or pro-choice, Calvinist or Arminian, or black or white, is more important than whether they are part of the family of God. We cannot allow this to be a picture of the church, because ultimately, what we found through reading and through surveys and personal interviews is that disunity hinders the mission of the church. Walter Brueggemann wrote, "The outcome, I suggest, is at best an anemic capacity to respond to the gospel for the sake of the world." So as we think about where we've been and we think about the divided nature of culture and how that often is displayed in the church, we come back to the experiences that we had during COVID. For some of us, that was really devastating. For others, not so much. And there were some factors that we'll talk about as to why it impacted some more deeply than others. But I think essentially what we saw in COVID, and the reason that it was more difficult for some than others, is that COVID revealed and accelerated what was already happening. So the divisions that we have in the church did not happen because of COVID. It exacerbated it, and the changes that were already taking place simply happened all of a sudden, rather than over the course of 10 or 15 years. Carey Nieuwhof said over and over during the pandemic, crisis accelerates change. Another person who I heard, I can't remember who said this, but they said it was as though COVID like ripped years out of the timeline. So the changes that we saw were happening like this. And normally, if you didn't have COVID, it would have happened over the span of 20 years. And if it happens over the span of 20 years, pastors and church leaders can have the opportunity to kind of respond, and you kind of are able to navigate that a little more. But COVID took this 15 years out of the middle of it. And so now we're having to respond to a sudden, drastic change, which simply revealed what was already taking place, what was foundational already there, but it happened all at once. The pandemic revealed and accelerated what was already happening. The equating of ideology with spirituality, that was already taking place. The divisiveness along ideological lines, that was already beginning to happen. For the most part, what we've seen, at least in our churches, was that it was not a case where you had conservative versus liberal. So you didn't have like the rascally Republicans against the dirty Democrats and they're like fighting, and it was more shades of conservatism. Because all of our pastors, as you'll see, all of our pastors identify themselves as center right. All of our church leadership center right. Even ministry context is almost all center right. And so we're looking not at liberal versus Democrat or liberal versus conservative, but we're looking at kind of shades of conservative and not quite conservative enough. And we're still dividing over that. And that happened in a drastic way, again, because crisis accelerated change. So while it was shocking to see it happen all at once, what really happened was that the superficial unity that many churches experienced was revealed for what it was. We had a superficial unity that was based more on the pragmatism of advancing an ideological or political cause than on being based on the mission of the church to fulfill the Great Commission. At times, that ideology, again, it can take shape of a religious or spiritual expression, but when things get difficult, what is at the foundation gets shown to be the most important. And when that foundation is not the mission of the church, ideologically driven disunity is the result. So again, my hope today is to show some stats. We'll take a big chunk to walk through the results of the survey, to show the state of churches and pastors across our region. We'll see how much IDD, ideologically driven disunity, is present in our churches and its impact. We'll see some correlations, some statistical correlations comparing two different sets of variables. We'll see some significant correlations. We'll see some surprising lack of correlations. We'll draw some conclusions from the research, and then I'll offer a possible way forward. But before we get into that too much, I want to share kind of what I'm calling some ground rules. Kind of some broad brush, here's what we're dealing with, here's what we're not dealing with, here's what we're trying to do. The first, and I want you to hear this clearly, there are two things that have been it's been tough to communicate through. The first is, the point of this project is not to determine which ideology is correct. All right, so I'm not telling you, you have to believe this. That is not the point. Because I am convinced that the Church of Jesus should have some diversity in it. We should even have diversity of thought. Partly because the New Testament is full of commands to be united. If we were all the same, man, they could have saved a whole lot of hand cramp in their writing, because they wouldn't have had to write all those commands. Stanley Hauerwas wrote, "Difference can threaten unity, but unity cannot be Catholic, it cannot be universal without difference." So, the point of this is not to say which ideology is correct. Second ground rule. This project focuses on the leadership aspect of addressing ideologically driven disunity. There's a spiritual component as well. That's not the point of this project. So we're going to assume a few things as we think about your church, your leadership, you yourself. First, we are assuming that you have a leadership comprised of believers. Okay, so I'm not gonna go in and say, well, you need to go and make sure all your leaders are believers. We're assuming that your leadership are believers. We are assuming that you are trying to follow Jesus. Okay, it would be really easy for me to say, the point of this project, you just need to follow Jesus. Let's close with a word of prayer. All right, so we're not doing that. We are assuming that you're following Jesus. We are assuming that you're praying. We will touch on that later on, but you should be praying as an individual and as a leadership team and as a congregation. You should be praying about unity. And we are assuming that you consider the Bible to be the guide for life and ministry. So those are assumptions. I'm not going to spend time talking about them other than the time that I just did. But those are some of the assumptions. So that's ground rule number 2. Ground rule number 3. I started with some presuppositions. I started saying, I think we're going to find this. A lot of them were affirmed. Some of them were totally incorrect. One of them was so incorrect, I thought, oh no, I'm going to have to start all over. I will tell you when my presuppositions were not affirmed. All right, just so you know, here's what I thought, and it was totally different. Fourth, this is for addressing IDD in a congregation. This is not about your political activity. This is not about how you handle discussions with unbelievers. This is how pastors and church leaders, specifically in churches in Rocky Mountain Church Network, I know we have a couple other guys here. You snuck in somehow. Obviously, there's overlap here, but this is for how we address ideologically driven disunity in a congregation. This is not how you have a conversation with a non-believer in Java Moon on Main Street here in Sheridan. This is how you address it within the context of your congregation. Because you could take what I'm saying and say you need to not be politically active at all. That is not what I'm saying. I want to be clear about that. This has a very narrow focus. Fourth, and I'm going to take a little bit of time to walk through this because this is foundational, it's very important, and it's very nuanced. there is clearly an overlap between theology and ideology. I think in a lot of ways we've gotten some of that overlap wrong, which we'll talk about. But a lot of times when we talk about ideology, someone will say, well, no, that's biblical. And so we're standing for biblical truth. Yes, there are biblical components to it. But are you really understanding the difference between your theology and your ideology? Again, there may be overlap, but it really matters which one we respond from. If we respond from our theology, we can respond in love. If we respond from our ideology, we typically respond in fear. So an example of how this gets really close and hard to navigate. One of the pastors in our focus group. So just so you know what we are talking about, I've done some academic research, lots of reading. We've done some personal interviews, some one-on-one interviews. I did an interview with 2 pastors. And then I have done a focus group where we had 5 pastors who participated in that. And then I'm having hopefully one more personal interview. So there are all sorts of different ways that we've collected data for this. As we talked in the focus group, one of the pastors shared an example that was born out of one of their values as a church. You may disagree with this, but this is the value of this church, which is that they want to have unbelievers serving in their church. Now, you can wrestle with the implications of that if you want. But again, this is their leadership team has made this determination with boundaries, right? Unbeliever is not teaching Sunday school. Unbeliever is not leading a life group. Unbeliever may be a greeter. Unbeliever may help in the parking lot. And they look for areas that unbelievers can serve so that they are together with believers. And they think that that is one way that they can draw people to Jesus. Now, first off, I just have to say, I really admire the fact that they have unbelievers who attend and attend so much that they want to serve. But it did bring up a very interesting problem. A gay woman wanted to hold babies in the nursery. So their elders met, they prayed, they talked, and they said, here's our determination of, what we're trying to do. This is not a teaching role. This is not a spiritual role. It's someone just holding a baby in the nursery. And so they determined that yes, she could do that. There was a family who was upset about it. Obviously. I mean, if you're like me, you're squirming a little in your chair just thinking about that and thinking about having the conversation. So this family thankfully came to the pastor, came to the elders, and said, we don't think that she should do this. And we don't think she should do it because the Bible is clear that this is a sin. So the pastor said, yes, it does. But the Bible is also clear that there are lots of other things that are sin. So would you have a problem with a straight woman who had a problem with alcohol, unbeliever, holding babies in the nursery? Oh no, that's fine because that's an issue that she would be working through. Here's where there's an overlap between theology and ideology. Biblical truth, homosexuality is a sin. Family deciding to pick and choose which was worse, I would contend is acting more out of ideology than theology. Now, there's overlap, yes. But I think, especially as church leaders, we need to readily admit where our responses are coming from. Because again, if we will respond out of theology, we can truly respond out of love. But if we respond out of ideology, the end result often is disunity because it's being driven by fear. The family ended up leaving their church because they did not agree with that. There's overlap between theology and ideology, but we need to be clear about where we're responding from. So that's ground rule number 4. And I can tell Tom Herzog wants to ask a question. We'll have a time for questions at the end of these ground rules. So what ground rule am I on? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So ground rule number 6. You may find my thoughts unsatisfactory. I just readily admit that. You may get to the end of this and think, you know what, John, that just is not helpful at all. That's unsatisfactory. And I get it, because at times I read through this and I'm like, man, this is this is not going to be helpful. So I've gone through this really crazy time as I've thought about giving the presentation and talking about this, that I've been like, I alternate between being excited to do it and being scared to death that it's going to be pointless and no one's going to be like, I drove 3 hours for this. So I get it. You may find these thoughts to be unsatisfactory, but if you do find them unsatisfactory, you may need to ask yourself, am I unsatisfied because of the answer, or am I unsatisfied because of my own ideology? That's something that you may need to wrestle with. And then lastly, it will take time. We did not get here overnight. It feels like we got here overnight because of COVID, but we were moving this way. We've been moving this way for a long time. And since we did not get here overnight, I'm telling you, you could do everything that I say, and you're still going to have disunity because it takes time. But it is clear that we need to address ideologically driven disunity. It will take a while to move towards that. There will be pain. There will be conflict. There will be some steps forward and steps back. But I think it's imperative that we start now as church leaders, that we start now in trying to address unity. There's an old proverb that says, when's the best time to plant a tree? 20 years ago. Like 20 years ago is the best time to plant a tree. When's the second best time? Today. And so as church leaders, let's start thinking through how we can address some of the disunity that we've seen, and in particular, the ideologically driven disunity. Any questions? Do you have one, Tom?
Well,
leave this mic on. There's a little button here on the back. It should be solid green. But this way, the people who are watching on live stream can hear the questions.
It's really just to help my thinking, and you keep. I ran into it with the devotionals too, in terms of the separation and now and overlap. You're saying of ideology and theology, and I'm wondering if they're more conjunctive as opposed to overlap, ideological theology or theological ideologies, and that we allow ourselves to huddle up into our group of at least we think alike when it's silly that we don't. But I don't know. Can you just address that what a little more in terms of overlap versus is it really a separate? Maybe it's separating or defining better ideology for me. Maybe that's my question.
Yes, and we will get to that because there are some really clear aspects of ideology that I think are important to understand. In particular, the foundational nature of ideologies, which I don't think as church leaders we've understood well enough. That ideologies really become foundational, and they go back to how we were raised, they go back to experiences, and they end up informing the growth in our life rather than the other way around often. But we'll spend some time unpacking those thoughts. If we don't get there well enough, revisit it and tell me, John, you missed that. All right. So, any other questions? All right, let's take some time to look at biblical foundations. So we'll work through biblical foundations and then we'll take a break. As I think about the biblical foundations, this won't be the longest section. So there's the devotional that was part of the project. It's available on the project website. There's a lot of the theological component that's it's rooted in there. It's rooted in some foundational passages. But as I say that this won't be the longest section, I also have to remember I'm a preacher. And so who knows how long we're going to be here. So we're going to just think about three key passages as we think about some of the foundational or the theological or biblical foundations for the rest of the work. The first of those is Matthew chapter 16. Matthew 16, really familiar scene. Jesus has gathered with his disciples north of Israel, and he asks them the simple question, who do men say that I am? And they respond, well, some say you're a prophet, some say you're Elijah, some say you're John the Baptist, which I always think that doesn't make sense because they're in the same room together at times, but that's what they're saying. All of those answers, they give Jesus a little bit of respect, but they miss the fact of who he is. So then Jesus says, well, who do you say that I am? And Peter responds for the rest of the disciples, and he says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus, at least in my John Kraft biblical imagination, Jesus has this huge exclamation. Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, because flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who's in heaven. And my rough paraphrase of that is, holy cow, Peter, this is awesome. Because God must have revealed that to you because you're not smart enough to figure that out on your own. I mean, that's essentially what Jesus is saying. And then he says, you're Peter. Upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. And so Jesus here gives an incredible promise. He gives this incredible promise that he will build his church. And he builds his church in a couple of ways. He builds his church because the church is moving forward. The church is pushing ahead. And I say that because Jesus says, I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. For a long time, I think the church got this wrong. Because we think of the church huddled together and the world and culture and Satan attacking the church. And though Satan should buffet, we'll be safe and secure from all alarm. To mix up a couple of hymns right there. That, no matter what Satan throws at us, the church is going to exist. And I think that is entirely the wrong picture. And I think it's the wrong picture for the key reason that gates are not an offensive weapon. Gates are purely defensive. Purpose of a gate, keep someone out or to keep someone in. If your gate is open right now, your dog's running down the street. Satan wants to keep people in his domain. When the church pushes against the gates of hell, The gates of hell cannot stand against it. And that's where you see God's kingdom further and grow. So the church should be moving forward. And as the church moves forward, and I would contend moves forward in unity and purpose and mission, Jesus will build his church. But he also builds his church as it focuses on him. He is the Christ, the Son of the living God. He is the one that the nation of Israel was waiting for. He is the one that God had prophesied from the very beginning. Adam and Eve, they get kicked out of the garden. Genesis 3, God's doling out curses. And to the snake, he says, I'll put enmity between your seed and her seed, the seed of the woman. You will bruise his heel, but he will crush his head. That's the proto-evangelion, the nutshell, the very seed of the gospel, seen at the very beginning, that God would send one who would defeat Satan and set his people free. So as a church, Jesus builds his church as it focuses on him, on who he is and what he's done. And because of that, we move forward and push against the gates of hell. But then lastly, out of this passage, I want you to notice Jesus gets very possessive of the church. He gets very possessive. He says, what? Not I will build a church or I will build the church. He says, I will build my church. And as church leaders, we have to always remember this is not our church. As church leaders, we always have to remind our people, this is not our church. This is not your church. Which means we're not the ones who set the agenda. He is. We listen to his voice because it is his church. When I was in local church ministry, I was always very careful. I tried to be very careful to not say, well, at my church, or to say, well, yeah, if you go over to Chad's church, which that's the same church, by the way, because it's not ours. It's not Chad's. It's not Aaron's. It belongs to Jesus. It's his church. And because it's his church and not ours, he's the one who gets to set the mission, which we see in Matthew chapter 28. Matthew chapter 28, verses 18 through 20, and the lead up to this, you see Jesus gathers specifically the 11 disciples. They're there. It says they come, they see Jesus, they worship, love the little clause that's also in there, but some doubted. I mean, they're still wrestling with what in the world is going on. And they come to Jesus, and Jesus says, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. And because this authority has been given to me, now I am sending you. Go, therefore, and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And lo, I am with you always. In this charge, Jesus gives the mission of the church. And the mission of the church is to make disciples. That is our mission. There is no other mission of the church. This is the only mission. This is what Jesus says, until I come back, this is what you're supposed to be doing. Make disciples. Now, it can take different forms in different contexts, in different leadership groups, in different congregations. But at the core is making disciples. But I have been convinced for a long time that we've had a fundamental misunderstanding of what making disciples is. In that a lot of people, particularly in conservative churches, equate disciple making with what has come to be known as discipleship. So when I was a high schooler, John Tanous, who's one of my high school sponsors, said, hey, John, do you want to do discipleship? It's like, yes, I do. Because John was the coolest guy I knew. And he said, okay, we'll meet together. And we met together, and he gave me a notebook. And he had a notebook that had blanks in it, and I had a notebook that had the same blanks in it, and John would fill out his notebook, and I would fill out my notebook, and we would talk about our notebooks. And discipleship has often taken the form, the transfer of information from one person to another. Discipleship is not disciple making. Because as we look at the Great Commission, we see three aspects to it. The first aspect comes when we see that Jesus says, baptizing them. Baptizing them. This indicates that there are people who are coming to Christ. Making disciples includes people being transferred from the kingdom of darkness to the kingdom of God's beloved Son. One of our pastors, he pastors Washington Heights Church in Ogden, Utah, is Roy Gruber. Roy is going through the arduous process of getting his doctorate. I wish he would have warned me before I started, because this has been tough. But Roy, his doctorate is about how we can help people who come to Christ move along the spectrum to be able to step into leadership more quickly than typically happens in a church. And so as part of it, he's putting together a video curriculum that if someone comes to Jesus, they can learn more about him and about what that means and about how to serve the church. And in the first video, which he asked me to watch and give feedback, so I wrote a letter to his prof just talking about how I could see it being used in our churches. He made a really great point, which is Jesus' model of making disciples included calling people to follow him who were not currently following him. So Matthew, what do we see? Matthew's in his tax booth. He is not following Jesus. And Jesus says, you follow me. And Matthew goes from someone who is not following Jesus to someone who is following him. And so looking at the example of Jesus, looking at what we see in Scripture, we're looking to see that in the context of the Great Commission, Jesus says baptizing them, that part of disciple making is seeing people who are not currently following Jesus begin to follow Jesus. Second thing that we see in the Great Commission is teaching them. There is the transfer of information. There has to be the transfer of information. Because as people come to Christ, they need to learn about him. And so part of making disciples is what has been called discipleship, but there is the transfer of information from those maybe who know more to those who are learning, or maybe those who are journeying along together or learning together, but there is a transfer of information from one group to another, from those who are following Jesus to those who are starting to follow Jesus more closely. But then thirdly, it's not simply baptizing them and teaching them, but it's teaching them to observe everything that I've commanded you, is how Jesus phrases that. That the goal of making disciples isn't simply to win converts. Okay, it's not simply to have people pray to receive Christ. I had a college student tell me about a church in Laramie. He said, oh, that church, it's just a conversion factory. Which, first of all, I thought sounded amazing. Like, if you're going to have a conversion factory, I'm like, oh, I don't know what's wrong about that. But he said, that's just a conversion factory. And what he meant was, they're just having people come to know Jesus, but then they don't teach them at all. That's not right. But we do see them come to Christ. We teach them about him, but that's not the end. The transfer of information is not the end. The goal is to help them experience life transformation, that they live differently because they came to Christ and learned about him. So as I look at the Great Commission, what I see is people coming to Christ, people learning about Christ, and people looking more like Christ. That is what it means to make disciples. People coming to Jesus, learning about Jesus, and looking like Jesus. And I would contend Disciple making has to include all three. If it does not, then you are not adequately or completely fulfilling the Great Commission. And I would contend you're not on the mission that Jesus has called this church to be on. Last passage is John 17. John 17, very, very quickly. John 17 happens. John 13, you see Jesus gathers disciples for the Last Supper. He washes disciples' feet. He sends Judas out to betray him. He institutes the Lord's Supper. And then following that time, he says, I've given you an example that you should follow. You should be serving one another. Then he teaches, John 14 through 16, he teaches about end time stuff. He teaches about the Holy Spirit, teaches about how we live, how we abide in him. And then John 17, right before he goes to the Garden of Gethsemane, we see him give what's commonly called a high priestly prayer that Jesus prays, and he prays for his disciples. He first of all prays that God is glorified, that God's glorified in him, that God would glorify Jesus so that God would himself be glorified. And then he prays for the disciples. He prays that they would not be taken out of the world, but they would be left in the world, but they would be kept from the evil one. Then he gets to John 17:20. And John 17:20, we see Jesus ultimately pray for the unity of the church throughout the ages. We see that because in John 17:20, Jesus changes, and he changes from praying for those in the room to specifically praying for those who would come to believe in him through their word. There's twice where Jesus specifically says, this is not what I'm praying for, which I'm not sure God needed that clarification. So he's praying that for the benefit of those who are listening. He says, first, I'm not praying you take him out of the world, but leave him in the world. Not of the world, but leave him here. And then he says, I am not praying for these only, but I am praying for all those who would believe in me through their word, which includes everyone sitting in this room. Because as believers in Jesus, we believe because of the testimony of those who walked with Jesus. That's the only way that happens, is we look at the testimony that they wrote down. 1 John chapter 1. We've walked with Jesus, we heard him teach, we held him, we touched him. And after all of that, this is our testimony, that God is light and in him there's no darkness at all. But that comes because they spent time with him, his testimony. All of us believe because of the testimony of his word, of their words. And so what we see is that Jesus is not just praying for the 11, but he's praying for all of us. He's praying for you. He's praying for the believers in your church. Every single person who comes to him through the testimony of their word. And what we see is, especially in that context, from John 17:20 on to the end, several times, once or twice before that, he prays for the unity of the church. He says, I pray that they would be one, even, Father, as you and I are one. You and me, I and you, we and them, that we would be one. But then he also says, I pray that they would be one so that the world would know that you sent me. So the unity of the church affirms Jesus' mission. It affirms the fact that Jesus is the Christ, the one sent by God. The unity of the church also empowers our mission. The unity of the church empowers our mission. So, it is essential that we think about the unity of the church because it's built upon who Jesus is and what he's called us to do. And what he's called us to do is fulfill the Great Commission charge of making disciples. And we do that most effectively when we have unity with one another based on the fact that the Trinity is united and we are saved through their work and empowered to fulfill what they've called us to do. Biblical foundation for what is going to happen moving forward. So we are going to take a quick break. because we've gone like 1 hour already. I know. And not one person fell asleep unless you fall asleep with your eyes open, which is a very good skill to have. We are going to take a 10-minute break. So we will be back 10 after 11. If you're watching online, if you have questions, again, you can type them in the chat bar on the side. Other than that, we will be back in 10 minutes.
John, do you need that other TV on here?
No, I'm catching this one, and then I can also All right, everyone, let's soldier on. Let's push forward as we keep going. All right, so as we move forward, we do want to take some time to unpack the initial survey. So the project participants all completed a survey that it covered a range of topics. And so we do want to share what we found out about our churches. And as we dive into this, this is what is called an action research project. And as an action research project, there are two characteristics that I had to adhere by. The first of those is an action research project addresses a specific problem in a specific context. And so my degree that I'm working towards is a DMin, which may be exercised at some point later on, Doctor of Ministry. That is over against a PhD. And the big difference is a PhD is an academic degree. And so your research could be much more scholastic, academic. Here's how you read the Dead Sea Scrolls. Here's some new data that I've uncovered from the Dead Sea Scrolls. That could be a PhD dissertation. A DMin is a professional degree, which means a couple of things. First of all, you cannot go straight through from a master's program into a DMin unless you have years of experience in a church. And so I could not have gone from bachelor's to master's to DMin without serving in a church for 5 years. And so it's because it's a professional degree. As part of the action research, we are addressing a specific problem. And so in this case, the problem is that pastors and church leaders within the Rocky Mountain Church Network are negatively impacted by ideologically driven disunity. And there are following results of that. The action research also is a specific problem, but it's also a specific context. And at Liberty University, which is where I'm doing my DMin, they want that to be actually a very specific context. And so I would have loved to have done this research over 300 churches in the Rocky Mountain region. But I'm not a part of 300 churches in the Rocky Mountain region. I'm the executive director of the Rocky Mountain Church Network. So we started with our pool of churches. There are 48 churches in the Rocky Mountain Church Network. We span the 4 Rocky Mountain states, Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, and Utah. And we have 2 outlier churches, one church in Kansas and one Spanish-speaking church in Nebraska. And I tell them, do you see any mountains here? I've been to Ulysses, Kansas. There ain't a mountain anywhere nearby. The tallest thing that is there is the corn. And but they are a part of us. So specific problem, specific context. And so as we look at the churches in our project, there were 22 churches represented, which is not a huge pool, but it actually is statistically significant when you think of the pool that you start with. I had hoped to get half of our churches, and could have wrangled a couple of arms, to get 2 more to put us at half representation. But one guy was on sabbatical and another was doing other things in their church. And I was like, no, if I need it, I'll come back. But I felt like 46% was statistically significant enough when you look at the pool that we started with. The other aspect of an action research project is that it has to bring something of benefit to the stakeholders. So the participants in the project have to be benefited by the project. And in this case, my hope is that we can give you some tools, some understanding and some tools to be able to address IDD in your own congregation. So as we think about the churches that we have represented, we see that we have 22 churches out of our 48. That's 46% of the Rocky Mountain Church Network congregations. There are churches from all 4 Rocky Mountain states represented in this. And we'll touch on this in just a moment, but churches from Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, and Utah. I'm going to kind of break these down into different categories. So first are some data concerning congregations in the Rocky Mountain Church Network, in particular, congregations in the project. So the first is ministry context. We ask, are you rural, urban, or suburban? Out of the 22 who participated in the project, 54.5%, a little more than 54.5%, a little more than half said they're a rural setting. The remaining 45% were suburban. We do have a few churches that would be considered urban in Denver, but for a few different reasons, they did not participate in the project. But I think this is actually a pretty fair representation of who we are. And partly that's just a reflection of who we are as a region. Like there are no metro areas in Wyoming. I mean, unless you count Casper, because there are 2 suburbs. There's like, was that Mills and Evansville or something like that? Yeah. So there's no real urban area in Montana. You can get a little bit in Billings. Downtown Billings can be a little scary if you go on the wrong street at night. But there's not really big urban areas. Our big urban areas would be Denver, Salt Lake City, and probably counting Colorado Springs. We have very few urban churches. We don't have any church that would be urban in the Springs or in Salt Lake City. They're all suburban. So all that to say, this is a fairly accurate representation of who we are. We cover a wide range of sizes. You can see that churches go all the way from 0 to 50 to one church participated. It's over 1,000. In fact, their average attendance is about 1,900 on a Sunday morning. And you can see it's actually fairly well distributed in between there. So a wide range of congregational sizes. One thing that was interesting, and I had a very specific reason for asking this, and I'll come back to why I asked this question, but is to look at the ages of our congregation. And not age demographic, but how long has your church been in existence? The churches represented in our study and our project have been around a long time. The average age, and average, in this case, average and median were almost identical, which means they're pretty well distributed. Average age was 88 years in existence. Half of the churches were over 100. We had 2 churches that were over 150 years old. The youngest church represented in our project was 24 years, which in my view, this is a side note, this is not a project note, it partly reflects the lack of focus or emphasis on church planting in the Rocky Mountain Church Network over the last 30 years. It's been 20 years since we planted a church, where we had a concerted effort within Rocky Mountain Church Network to plant a church. I've been talking with the board about how we can change that and how we can start planting some churches. Had conversations with a church planting couple who are fabulous and will probably be launching a church in early 2024. And we will be inviting churches to join with us because okay, now I'm going to go way off the rails here for just a moment. We simply need more churches. I don't know if you read the article, it came out maybe 3 months ago. Pew Research's latest survey of church openings and closures, that data came from 2019. It was Gallup. It was the first time in the history of that study that there was an actual, I can't think of the word I want to use right now, but there were actually more churches closed than open. There was an actual net loss of churches in 2019. For a long time, we've said more churches open than closed, but we've been falling behind population growth. That just if you take the average size of a church and project that against population as a whole was growing faster than we were planting churches. 2019, more churches closed than were open, and that was pre-COVID. And so we need to be about planting churches. And I think our board is committed to that. I'm committed to that. We're starting to move forward in some of those ways. Okay, back on track. Now that I have my little soapbox talk done. And let me just say, we love it when churches are around a long time. I think it's a fabulous thing. I was senior pastor here, and when we were here, we celebrated 125 years of ministry. But we called it a good start because we knew that there was stuff ahead. Churches that are around a long time, great, as long as they have a bigger windshield than they do a rear view mirror. And so, yes, we're moving forward in ministry, but churches have been around a long, long time. We also tried to gauge kingdom impact. We tried to gauge kingdom impact, and we did that. It's always tough to gauge that, but we did that simply by asking about a number of professions of faith in the last 12 years, or 12 months, and number of baptisms in the last 12 months. And then I was thinking through, how do we compare and contrast that, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. But I realized that as we're trying to compare how many people come to faith in a congregation, it's not necessarily fair to compare that, a church of 25 versus our church of 1900. That's not an equal comparison. So I tried to break it down into number of professions of faith per attender. But then I realized I didn't ask for individual size, I asked for ranges of size. And so I used the best way I could figure this out was to give each church an average size. So if you said we're a church of 0 to 50, you said you're 25. If you're a church 50 to 100, you're 75. All the way up, the church that was over 1,000, we said you're 1,500. And just tried to give an average size of church. Using that, our church has had an average in the last 12 months of 0.04 professions of faith per attender. So to put that in a different, more accessible figure, because you don't have 4/100ths of a person come to Jesus, for every 100 attenders, we saw 4 people come to faith. Our church that had the most per attender was actually not one of our larger churches. It was a church that fell, if I recall correctly, it fell in the 100 to 250 range. Had for every 100 attenders, 13 people come to Christ. Baptisms, almost identical in figure. And not just identical in overall average, but identical among congregation. So trying to gauge kingdom impact is difficult. That was one of the ways that we tried to do that. Then we had some data concerning pastors. And we asked about the tenure of the pastor. And it's kind of all over the map because this was kind of a self-identified, how long have you served your church? And people typed in all sorts of stuff. I tried to go in and clean it up to make it all kind of similar. But you can see down at the end, we have 8 months, which is it's more on that chart than 35 years because 8 is higher than the 3 and 35. So that's just to show that we're kind of all over the map. We have a wide range of tenures. The average tenure was 11.2 years. The median tenure was 7.5. And so that's skewed because we have a couple of pastors who've been at their church for a long time. We have a 35 and a 27-year pastorate. So those are what skewed those average numbers. We did have a couple of project participants who've been at their church for less than a year. We had 2 who were there for 6 months and 1 who was there for 9 months. We're thankful for them. A couple of them, as I say this survey was completely anonymous, which was great because people could be honest. But then it makes my job really hard because I can't ask follow-up questions because I have no idea who they are. Although I do know some of the new pastors, and they're doing fabulous stuff. I'm really thankful for our new pastors, even though I don't know who they are because it was totally anonymous. Education of pastors. What's the highest level that you've attained? Out of our project participants, 1/2 have a master's degree. 1 has a doctorate. 2 have a bachelor's degree, and then the rest were kind of scattered, some masters, some doctoral education. This actually will come into play later on, but just so you have an idea of educational levels of a pastor. Then I also asked, what is your political leaning, like your personal political leaning? And unsurprisingly, our pastors were center right. So on this scale, 1 was very conservative, 5 was very liberal. And we were all center to right. Average of that was 2.2 on that scale. So clearly less than the center, or more conservative than the center by a little bit. Moving forward, data concerning the presence and impact of ideologically driven disunity. What we found was that the majority of our churches in the last 12 months have experienced IDD. 59, a little more, 59% have experienced disunity in the last 12 months. That number goes up when you ask about COVID, whether COVID worsened ideologically driven disunity. That number was 72, almost 73% said yes, COVID worsened ideologically driven disunity. Frankly, I was a little surprised this number was this low. It has been an outlier when I've talked to someone and they said, yeah, we didn't have any disunity at all during COVID. I've talked to a couple of pastors who've said that, but for the most part, we all experienced disunity during that season. More than half said that ideologically driven disunity was worsened by 2020 election and its aftermath. So that includes January 6th, it includes everything that we saw in that season. Troublingly, more than half said that IDD has impacted their church's ability to fulfill the Great Commission. So this is a church leader saying, yes, because of disunity, we have been hindered in fulfilling our call to make disciples. I'm going to take a moment and stop right here because we're going to kind of shift gears, still talking about data, but does anyone have any questions? And then we can just leave this mic over here. Again, you can leave it on.
Okay. John, I was just curious, did you sort the data to look at the center-right politics and the question of COVID and the question of disunity in the church? Did you sort it that way?
Yes. So we sorted all sorts of different ways, and we'll talk about that in the next section. We'll show some correlations that were there in the data. And I'll explain kind of the process that we went through to look for correlations. Some of it was a little easier because there were yes or no questions. Some of it is gauging correlation between 2 sets of variables, which is a little trickier, but we did both of those. So we'll unpack that in just a moment. So be a little more patient, all right? All right. And again, if you're watching online, you can type a question into the chat bar if you have something. And I'll try to remember to look over and see if anyone's typed anything there. All right, so moving on. Some data concerning the impact of IDD on pastors and church leadership. So we asked several questions. Has this impacted you? Has it impacted your leadership team? You know, what are some of the things that have taken place? 77% said ideologically driven disunity has caused stress on the pastor. What I found interesting in this is higher than reported IDD in their congregation. But it very clearly is something that has caused stress. We asked to rate that level. Oh no, sorry, I'm ahead. This was 31% of higher than the presence of IDD in a congregation. Yet what we see is that our pastors have clearly been stressed and experienced stress because of disunity, because of those conversations that you have to have, because of, I mean, I remember even just personally thinking about going to board meetings that I knew were going to be kind of contentious, and how do I handle this? And it caused a great deal of stress on me personally, and that has been borne out in interviews and has been borne out in the data itself. Ideologically driven disunity has caused stress on church leadership as well. So this is looking, we asked specifically about trustees, deacons, elders, you know, whatever your leadership team is, has it caused stress on them? And again, clearly, yes, 72, almost 73% as well. But then it was fascinating to see this shift when I asked specifically about whether your leadership team was experiencing disunity. So the first question was, is it causing stress on you all? Then I asked, are you experiencing disunity in your leadership team? And that number dropped precipitously to just 27% of leadership teams experiencing disunity among them. That number was even smaller when I asked about church staff. And for the purpose of the survey, we define staff as being either paid or volunteer, but those who are about the business of doing the work of the church. So your youth pastor, if you have one, associate pastor, or the nursery worker, you know, those who are serving maybe on a volunteer capacity. Those who are serving in the church, they as a group experienced even less. 18% disunity in those groups. And there's some further data that we'll unpack that I think shows why. And so now we are going to move, Kevin, you didn't have to wait too long, into seeing correlations, like some of the actual correlations in the data from the initial survey. The first thing that I want to point out was that in some regards, there was a surprising lack of correlation. In a lot of things that I thought, oh yes, this is going to be it, or this will be it, almost no correlation. So I think there are two reasons why some of these things did not have direct correlation. The first is that sometimes there wasn't much difference in the responses from the participants. So I asked a question thinking we'd have a range of responses, and instead it was like almost a big monolithic block. So we asked about soteriology. What do you believe about salvation? Do you hold a Reformed view? You hold an Arminian view? Or do you hold what I called a traditionalist view? You know, kind of traditional Baptistic view, at least in my experience. Yes, there's predestination, but there's also free will and human responsibility, and how those work together we're not entirely certain, but we'll figure it out in the end. You know, that's kind of the traditional Baptist view. And so I asked that question, and like 81% said we hold a traditionalist view. Well, you can't make statistical correlations when you've got this big chunk that's the same, because it's almost a whole pool. Same thing was true for preaching style. I thought, well, maybe preaching style can play a role. You know, if you're preaching just on topics, maybe you dive into topics that are more interesting or cultural, and so that's going to bring some disunity. Well, out of the 22 participants, only 2 said they do topical. So 91% are saying, yes, we do expositional. Well, again, I can't make statistical correlations from that because that's literally almost the entire pool. But then there were some correlations or lack of correlation that had difference in responses, but no statistical correlation at all. And so I used to find correlation when we had 2 sets of variables. Okay, so an example of this would be, which we'll get into in just a little bit, how long have you served at the church was one question, and then rate the impact of IDD on your congregation. Totally separate question, 2 sets of variables. I used what's called Pearson's correlation coefficient, which is a way where you can take 2 sets of variables and see the degree to which they impact one another. There's a very, very long formula to figure it out. It involves factorials and square roots and multiplying, and I have no idea how to do that, but there's a function within Google Sheets where you can say, here's this set of variables and this set. What is the correlation, if any? And you get a range from -1 to +1. -1 is a negative correlation. And if you had -1, it would be almost unheard of. The only time I got either a -1 or more specifically, I got 1 was when I accidentally put in 2 sets of the same number into the figure. But -1 would be when this set of variables goes up, this one goes down. And then there's a scale, which is in your presentation notebook, a scale to rate the strength of that relationship between 0, which would be no, and -1, which would be the strongest negative correlation possible. And then you go from 0 to 1. 1 would be when this set goes up, then this set goes up the exact same. Or kind of a scale between. And it accounts for, well, sometimes this one is a little higher on this one response and this one is lower. If you look at that one, that one response, you can't gauge that. But using Pearson's correlation coefficient, you can ascertain that. And so that's what we use. There's a pretty standard scale to gauge whether that's no or negligible, weak to moderate to strong correlation between the 2. There were a few very surprising lack of correlations. I anticipated going into this that the amount of professions of faith or baptisms would have a direct impact on the presence or impact of ideologically driven disunity. And in fact, that's kind of what I based my whole premise on. And then I put these 2 sets together and there was almost no correlation. I was like, man, I need to go back to 2020 and get this all started again. There were other things that were borne out that made me feel a little better about myself, but there was almost 0. I mean, literally, it was like 0.07 out of that scale of 0 to 1. No correlation there. There was no correlation, I thought, for certain political activity of the participants. So I just simply asked, how politically active are you? Rate yourself on a scale from very active to not active at all. 0 correlation between political activity of the participant and impact of IDD. Size of the congregation, socioeconomic status of the congregation, really no correlation in those at all. There were, however, some very significant correlations. There were some very significant correlations. Using a that kind of standard scale that you see. What page is that? Does someone have that up right now? Page 16. Moderate starts at 0.3 and goes up, I believe. If 15, page 15. Moderate correlation goes up to, or starts at 0.3 and then up. Most of these were moderate correlations. There were a couple that I slid into here because they were close enough. They were like 0.28 or above. Because it's kind of a little squishy scale. There's some wiggle room there. One last thing that's important to note is that in some of these, you cannot tell which is causative. So you can tell that they move the same way, but you don't know maybe which is causing which. Sometimes you can ascertain that. So one example I saw was outside of this project is there's a clear correlation between the number of calories in your diet and the presence of diabetes. Okay, that is a clear correlation. You can ascertain which is causing which. Okay, you don't have a high calorie diet because you have diabetes, but the opposite is true. If you have a high calorie diet, you're more likely to have diabetes. There are a couple of these where you can ascertain, but then a couple where you cannot, including the strongest correlation. Does anyone want to guess? Strongest correlation between one variable and the impact of IDD?
I think the head, is it the pastor tenure? Was that the?
Yes,
Yeah.
it was the pastor's tenure. The pastor's tenure was by far the strongest correlation to the lack of impact of ideologically driven disunity. And it was true, you can see it here. This was compared with the last 12 months, ideologically driven disunity, the impact of there. You can tell because the trend line is at an angle, it goes up and to the right. That is showing a correlation on that scatter plot there. On that scale, it was all of the three were right around 0.4. So they were into the strong correlation between tenure of the pastor and the impact of IDD. It was true whether you asked about the last 12 months. It was true whether you asked about COVID. It was true whether you asked about the 2020 election season. Now, this is one where if you are honest looking at the data, you may not be able to tell which is causative. There are some other factors that lead me to lean one way, but it could be that the pastor's been there a long time. He knows how to navigate relationships. He's a part of the culture, and so there's less ideologically driven disunity. Or it could be that there's less ideologically driven disunity, and so the guy doesn't want to leave because he knows he's got a sweet gig. I mean, that could be a very realistic way to interpret the data until you put some other aspects into it, which we'll come back to later. But that was by far the clearest correlation was tenure of the pastor. There was a weak to moderate, so it bumped up into moderate correlation between the typical political leaning of the ministry context, so the city that the ministry takes place in, and the impact of IDD. So what that means is that the more conservative an area was, or is, the less IDD someone experienced. That correlation was a little stronger when you talked about COVID. Was that the more conservative an area was, the less impact IDD has. What's important to note, though, is that both when you look at pastors, at church leadership, and ministry context, those are almost all center right. We had 2 respondents who said we have, on a scale of 1 being very conservative to 5 being very liberal, we had 2 who rated their ministry context as a 4. Because the fact of the matter is we don't have a church in Boulder. We don't have a church in some of the big liberal areas or bastions that we have in the Rocky Mountain areas, which are very few. I mean, typically we're a fairly conservative bunch. There are some liberal areas in Denver, Denver metro area, but for the most part, what we're looking at, and this affirms what I was thinking previously, is that we're looking at disunity among shades of conservative, rather than we've got these liberals and these conservatives in the church, with a couple of outliers. We'll talk about one later on because I think it was a really important lesson. This one fascinated me. First part of it, I was not surprised by. The second part, I was. The more a pastor addresses political issues from the platform, the more impact ideologically driven disunity has. I was unsurprised by that. And that was a moderate correlation between the two. If you had said, John, is this true? I would have said yes. What was fascinating is that number was reversed when you asked specifically about the 2020 election. Is that the more a pastor addressed political issues from the platform during that election season, the less impact ideologically driven disunity had. And I couldn't wrap my head around why. And this is one of those times where I wish it was not a completely anonymous survey, because I'd love to ask some follow-up questions. It could be because that pastor was skilled enough to be able to get everybody on the same page together. Or it could be that people who thought otherwise felt this isn't a place for me, and they left. And because they were not present anymore, there was not disunity. I'm unable to ascertain why. It was just a very fascinating correlation there. Another interesting thing to note was that educational levels had a moderate correlation to the impact of ideologically driven disunity. For the pastor, the higher their level of education, the less impact intellectually, ideologically driven disunity had on their congregation. Conversely, the higher the level of education of the congregation, the more impact ideologically driven disunity had. And again, there could be multiple reasons for that, but those who are higher educated may be more apt to debate, may be more apt to be entrenched in what they believe, may feel that they have more of a voice, more of a reason to be listened to, and therefore are more likely to be loud. Whatever the case was, the higher the level of education of the congregation, the more disunity a congregation had. One thing that was fascinating to me, and again, it almost made me rethink what I was doing, was that there was no positive pattern concerning mission and vision statements in the presence of ideologically driven disunity. So we asked 2 questions. Does your church have clear mission and vision statements? And does a majority of your congregation embrace the mission and vision of the church? For those who answered yes, there was no discernible difference in the impact of ideologically driven disunity, which really surprised me. I thought it'd be really easy to go through and these people said, yes, we have them, and they have no disunity. No, we don't have them. They have disunity, which the second actually was true. That there was a clear negative pattern concerning the absence of mission and vision statements and the absence of a congregation embracing it and the presence of the impact of ideologically driven disunity, or the presence of disunity. So in that, 80% 80% who said they do not have mission and vision statements, 80% experienced disunity during the last 12 months. 80% experienced it during COVID, and 80% during the 2020 election. If the congregation did not embrace the mission and vision of the church, so a majority does not embrace the mission and vision, 67% said we had disunity in the last 12 months. 83% said we experienced it during COVID, and 67% experienced it during the 2020 election, which tells me that there isn't necessarily a correlation to say, if you get a really great mission and vision statement, you're not going to have disunity. But if you don't have it, you're much more likely to have ideologically driven disunity. If you don't have it and your congregation doesn't embrace it, you're much more likely to experience it. Which means as pastors and church leaders, we have to be sure that we are over communicating the mission and vision of the church. You've got to feel tired of doing it. You've got to feel like, I can't believe I'm doing this again. Because at that point, your congregation is going to start getting it. And the more your congregation embraces it, the less ideologically driven disunity you're going to have. Any questions? This is a good spot for questions. Is the mic over there?
Yeah.
Okay. Any questions? Yeah, Cody, let's get you the mic so the people online can hear you.
Thinking about the even the definition of IDD, was there any way to gauge how the participants were perceiving the definition of IDD? Thinking about some of the more tenured pastors, I would think they would maybe have a tendency to minimize IDD type issues in their church, whereas maybe a new pastor would see any turmoil as a major IDD issue. Was there any way to kind of gauge that definition? Is it consistent throughout? What were some of the ways that you communicated that definition? It's kind of a big question. I don't know how to.
It is kind of a big question, and one, I'm not certain. So first of all, I didn't try to gauge that. But maybe I can go back through the data and look through that one more time. So I'm glad you're asking the question. But no, I don't have a way to address that.
Yeah, because I mean, just thinking about the maturity level of
Yeah.
the ministers, I mean, I would think that would have a major impact on how the church, or at least how the person answering the questions, would even define.
Yeah.
Like this is a major issue. We had so much turmoil. Other pastors that have been more experienced might be like, it's just a bump in the road, and it didn't really have, it was an issue, but it wasn't a crisis.
Yeah. No, that's a good point, Cody. Thank you. Yeah, Kevin. And don't ask me such a hard question.
So I'm wondering about the people that did not have IDD in their churches. Do you find evidence of what you might say like a right-wing pastor, right-wing church, right-wing context, and the reason they don't have it is because they're all fairly similar, not necessarily because of the significance of theological implications?
There actually wasn't much of a correlation between. So we did talk about the political activity of the pastor, but in terms of ideological leanings or political leanings of the pastor, or of the leadership team, or of the ministry context. Ministry context had a little bit more, but specifically pastor, church leadership, congregation, there really was not really any clear correlation.
I'm thinking, John, of
either way,
of a church in Idaho that's probably fairly well known, where there's probably a lot of equal signs in those, right? What the pastoral belief, the church belief, and the community belief, And you would expect there not to be any IDD there, but not necessarily because of theology, but because of they all have a shared
Yeah.
ideology.
Yeah. I'm trying to think through how to unpack the data, if we could take it to that level or not. You know, one of the problems is, you know, honestly, you get tasked to do all this stuff, and I'm not a statistician. You know, I can stand up here and impress you with Pearson's correlation coefficient, but I have to slow down every time I say that and think through how to pronounce it. So, you know, I'm given my best understanding of what I've seen, and I'm sure there's ways to unpack that, which I will go back through and look to see if there's a way to take a little deeper dive on that.
What about pastor tenure compared to elder board disunity, staff disunity? Was there a correlation there?
I need to start writing this down.
I'd just be curious if there was because, you know, having being pretty youngly tenured in the sense of having not been here long. And then really we hit all three of those. We had experienced disunity in those three, and it hit the congregation.
Yeah.
And new pastor trying to hire a new staff member, and then all that within 3 years when it all went down, and then getting nailed on, you know, really there was a staff member that came out strongly on an ideology that I felt like hit hard, and that caused division, I think, across the board. I'd wondered if I had, you know, if a pastor had been in church 20 years and perhaps a new voice would not have had as much impact. I don't know. I was just curious about.
No, and that is something I can do with the data that we have. I just didn't think to do that, and I thought I had done everything I could. So, because I mean, my spreadsheet is, I keep having to zip through. I'm like on column BB over here because I've gone through the alphabet a couple of times, and but that's one that I didn't measure, but I can measure very quickly, and that would be a really great thing to be able to add into the rest of my thesis. So thank you. Yeah.
John, and looking at the size of the communities, I mean, you had rural and you had urban, and there's a lot of homogenization, I'll say, that happens in small communities. Was that looked at in terms of the total population?
Yeah. So again, I don't have necessarily the total population. All I have is rural or suburban in this case, and there was no pattern no discernible pattern between those two. You know, some had, some didn't. There wasn't a way. It all looked like the overall data. Yeah. Okay, let's take a break. We've like downloaded a bunch of information. 10-minute break, and then we'll move on. Our next stop is going to be conclusions from the initial survey data. Like what can we draw out of this in order to begin to develop a strategy for moving forward? So 10 minutes, so we'll be back on at 10 after 12.
No, sir.
Very good. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. It's interesting when the questions come up and you're thinking, man, because I mean, I was looking at all these columns of data. I'm like, okay, I can compare this and this. I can compare this and this. And
And I don't, unless God does something miraculous, I don't see that.
Yeah, he
Turning around, and a lot of it is that church has the name.
Hmm.
And anybody who, anybody who would have a conservative view of, biblical inerrancy and that kind of stuff, they're not even going to visit that church.
All right, let's get started. Kind of get back into this. I know we've got a couple who are in the kitchen. Kevin Reiser, unsurprisingly so, and Marcus York.
good Baptist.
That's right. Hey, before we get into this next section, which is conclusions from the initial survey data, like looking at all this data, what are some broad conclusions that we can share? I want to touch base on a couple of things. One, several people have asked about my health. If you are unaware, March 7th, I got admitted to the hospital because I had a blood clot in my leg, which went from about halfway down my thigh down to my ankle. And I had one clot in the lower lobe in my right lung, and I had clots in both lobes in my left lung. And was a pretty serious diagnosis, and spent a night in the hospital. I'm on blood thinners now. I actually got to ride in the ambulance for the second time in my life a couple of weeks later because I was having some chest pains and lightheadedness, and everything that I read said you need to call 911. And I fought that and fought that. I mean, I literally had 911 dialed in my phone, backspace, backspace, backspace. No, I'm not going to do it. And so I ended up calling and asked the EMT if I should have called. And he said, the only problem I have is you didn't call sooner. Because at that point, it had been like 5 hours. And so just as a little PSA, if you feel like you have a blood clot, go get it checked out. I thought so I started feeling that when I was in December and didn't go into the hospital till March. And I had been dealing with shortness of breath when I would race on my bike, when I would really sprint and push hard. I'd experienced shortness of breath for like a month and a half, and I just figured I was out of shape because of the holidays. And but no, it was chunks of my lung being shut down because there were clots in there. And the biggest part of my hospital discharge instructions were how to spot a stroke, which was kind of scary. And also, they give you a 6-letter acronym to remember how to spot a stroke. I can't remember that now. Like, much less if I'm having a stroke, I'm never going to be able to remember all that. But seriously, pay attention to what your body is saying, and stay out of the hospital. But I'm doing fine. I'm on blood thinners. I will be for the next 3 months. The discussion between the doc and me was, is it 3 months or the rest of my life? Because my blood clots were unprovoked. And so after discussion, just because of fitness level and health and age and being scared, I said, when I'm off of blood thinners, if I feel like I have a blood clot, I'm getting it checked out, because at the level of my clots with treatment, the 30-day mortality rate was 5 to 7%. And so I'm not going to mess around with that. But doing fine. I've been cleared for exercise. I approached my doctor. It's like, you need to know what you're clearing me for. And, when I go hard on the bike, my heart rate will get up over 180. It'll be like 185. Is that okay? She said, just listen to your body. I said, okay. And I've taken it up to 185. I might have hit 186. I was out on a ride and started having chest pain when I did that. So I just backed off and cruised in with the group. And so, but doing fine. Lori and I are doing really well. Our boys are both doing great. We have a grandbaby on the way coming in August. One thing that you can pray for us about is one of our longest friends, closest friend, John Cook, a missionary that First Baptist supports, died very suddenly while serving in Iraq. Was leading a pastor's conference and was getting ready for the day, talking to Dee, his wife, on the phone, and just died. And so his funeral is tomorrow. So our whole family is going. I'm speaking at it. And so if you think of it, you can pray for the Cooks. Dee is his wife. They've got 4 kids who are 30 to 40 years old. And let's pray that God would be glorified. I know he was in John's life and in the work that he did. He worked with national pastors in India, Iraq, and Egypt. And while I was senior pastor here, I actually went to Egypt and spoke at a pastors' conference. And really amazing to see what God did through them. So, with that personal stuff out of the way, let's look at some conclusions from the initial survey data. The first conclusion that I see is that IDD exists in a wide range of ministry contexts. Part of my hope in addressing this is to remind you that you are not alone. One, if you've experienced disunity in your congregation, lots of other pastors and church leadership teams have as well. Which also means that it is not necessarily because of something that you've done. It's easy to think, I did A, and so I ended up with disunity. I said this, so I have disunity. We have these people in leadership, so I have disunity. It's easy to think that, but the fact of the matter is, there was no real correlation between either things pastors have done or ways that they've tried to address it. So we asked the question of how have you tried to address it? And I looked through that in as many ways as I could, and I could find no clear pattern between if a pastor did this, they had less disunity. That just was not there. It shows that so it was tempting when I first started working through the data, it was tempting to think that this was not a significant result because there's no like statistical correlation one way or the other. But it actually, I think, is one of the most significant in that we, by and large, have all experienced it to one degree or another. And we're all kind of in this boat together. And that as such, we as pastors and church leaders, specifically pastors within the Rocky Mountain Church Network, can support one another and encourage one another, pray for each other. And we want to start developing more and more of those relationships and connections. This has been a year of trying to put more network in our network, connecting pastors and churches. And this is one of the ways that we can do it. We've hosted some prayer gatherings. I was a little dismayed at one of our prayer gatherings in that we had 3 pastors who minister within 45 minutes of each other. The shortest one of those has been there 7 years. So one had been 7 years, one had been 13, one had been 30 years. And those 3 pastors, 45 minutes from each other, had never met. And so we're looking to see how we can take care of that. Provide ways for pastors to know each other and support each other, pray for each other, encourage each other. But IDD exists in a wide range of ministry contexts. The next one I think is significant, and it's significant for 2 reasons. One, it affirms what we all have been feeling, but then it also is going to help us unlock what I think is one of the best things that we need to know in order to move forward, which is that IDD is worsened by events. Ideologically driven disunity is worsened by events. This is due in part to the foundational nature of ideologies, which we'll unpack a little bit more in just a moment. But ideologies are foundational in that we often think that our ideology is built upon our theology. But a lot of times, it's the reverse. It at the very least is impacted by our ideology. Mark Laverton wrote, "What divides evangelicals can be found underneath our theology, on the often unrecognized mental and social frame on which our theology rests." So our ideologies, by and large, are foundational. And that's because they are rooted oftentimes in things that you've experienced your whole life. Part of the reason that I think the way that I do is because I grew up as a child of I always told my kids I'm a child of the 60s because I was born December 16th, 1969. But realistically, I'm a child of the 80s. That forms who I am. I grew up in Tucson, Arizona. Fairly conservative for being a fair-sized city, but then also with some liberal aspects because it's where the University of Arizona is. And I had one of my best friends, his dad was chairman of the music department at the U of A. And so that has some bearing on me. Some of my ideology and theology is based on the fact that when I went to church, in Tucson, I went to First Baptist Church of Tucson, Arizona, which is was an iconic conservative Baptist church, very foundational in our movement. One of the pastors who'd been there for 50 years at the heyday of the church, his name is R.S. Beale. The name R.S. Beale is all over the history of the conservative Baptist movement. That's part of the basis of my ideology. Part of the basis of my ideology is the fact I grew up in a highly, I don't have enough highlies, dysfunctional home. Lots of abuse, lots of neglect. Things that I can't believe that I made it out with any sense of wholeness. The only reason I made it out with any sense of wholeness has a large part to do first with Jesus, absolutely, but then also the ministry of First Baptist Church. And so all of that plays a role in how I think about the world. I am going to be different than Kevin Reiser, who grew up in California, of all places. And so who knows how liberal crazy he is? Well, no, actually, what has happened is there's been a little bit of a reaction the other way because of some experiences growing up. But that has to do with the fact I grew up in Tucson, grew up in the 80s. Kevin's a little younger than me. I grew up in California, different family scenarios. It all has to play into our ideology. And our ideology oftentimes informs our theology more than we want to admit. And there's something else that plays into this, which is that ideology masquerades as spirituality. There is a lot of overlap between the two. It's easy to confuse ideology and religion or spirituality or even theology at times. There's a British political scientist whose name was Maurice Cranston, who gave a definition of ideology. And it was really one of the foundational definitions of ideology because people were not really talking about that at the time. And he said an ideology has 5 characteristics. He says an ideology is comprehensive. Ideologies are comprehensive in that they seek to encompass all of the human experience. So everything that you experience, you can kind of fit into your ideology. They're comprehensive. They are goal-oriented in that they have an objective toward which adherents of the ideology strive. Okay, and so to use an extra church example, you think of the ideology that's surrounded in environmentalism. There's a very clear goal that they're striving towards. So an ideology is goal-oriented. Thirdly, they require effort to maintain. They require that you put energy into it. You can't simply just think about an ideology. You put effort into maintaining it. Fourthly, Cranston said an ideology requires a commitment to a cause, that there's something greater that you're working towards. And then lastly, he said, they are intellectual, in that an ideology is based more on reason than on emotionalism. And beyond that, the leaders of an ideology are often those who are more highly educated or have a better ability to communicate. So now I want you to pretend that we don't have a definition of an ideology on the screen, but we have a definition of spirituality. It's comprehensive. It seeks to encompass everything that we believe. It is goal-oriented. We have a goal that we are advancing, a commitment to a cause. The goal should be the Great Commission. But sometimes that theology or spirituality, sometimes we slide a different goal into there, but it feels the same. They require an effort to maintain. How many of you have preached a series on spiritual disciplines? There's a reason we call them disciplines, because they take work. It takes effort to maintain your relationship with Jesus. They require a commitment to a cause, that we ask people to do all sorts of things. We ask people to give up of their time. We ask people to give up of their resources. We ask people to give money. They require a commitment to a cause. And then lastly, how many of you have said something like, worship isn't just based on emotion. Your relationship with Jesus, it's not just about how you feel. And then beyond that, it's intellectual in that people who have greater education often are elevated to a higher position. Which one, I think Liberty is really thankful for, because I'm paying them money to get a doctorate. And those who are able to communicate more or more effectively, they get elevated to a higher level as well. And so there is a ton of overlap or similarities between theology, spirituality, more spirituality, and ideology. They look the same, and because they look the same, ideology can spring up in unexpected times. Because as we specifically think about the impact of events, we can have a superficial unity while ideologies are not challenged. But when you add the external stressor in, then what is foundational is what gets displayed. And if theology is not the foundation, or mission is not the foundation, then what is will get shown. There's a counselor, I read this online. It was just a fascinating little quote. And it has so much application. In fact, I told our younger son, Cameron, about it. And he's like, I'm going to use that with my students. He works with student body government at UW. Wayne Dyer was having a conversation with a man just about why you respond to things. And why do you respond to things the way that you do? And he said, I asked this guy, so when you squeeze an orange, what do you get? The guy said, well, you get orange juice. Why is that? Because that's what's inside. He said, in the same way, when you squeeze a human, what is truly inside is what comes out. So it may look great and you're moving along together and everyone's singing songs together and going to Bible studies together. Then you add the stressor of COVID, 2020 election, 2024 election, just to give you a heads up, because there's another one coming. When you add that stressor, oftentimes what is on the inside is what comes out. And that is an important conclusion that we have to remember, because it will come up over and over again. And that especially happens in our interactions with people when we don't realize or recognize the foundational nature of ideologies. Thirdly, third kind of big broad brush conclusion is that IDD is weaker when relationships are stronger. And so I started off as we talked about the correlations. When you look at the correlation between the impact of IDD and tenure of pastor, he said there's maybe you aren't able, if you look at this one factor, you're not able to ascertain which is causative. Like it could be pastor there longer and so there's less IDD, or there's less IDD so the pastor sticks around. Those are both valid ways to look at that data. But I think when you add the other components of the lack of impact on leadership teams and on church staff, I think you get a clearer picture that those relationships, particularly ministry relationships, the stronger those relationships are, the less impact IDD has. Now that's a broad brush statement, and obviously there will be outliers. But the stronger relationships we can have with one another, the weaker the impact of IDD is. I'll get into another reason why I think that, which comes out of not the quantitative research. So what we've talked about by and large here is quantitative research, the data that comes from the survey. We also have done qualitative research in doing interviews and focus groups. And a lot of what was born out of those in terms of what helped during COVID and what helped during the 2020 election, I think shows that really what is causative in the relationship between tenure and presence or impact of IDD is that better relationships, longer tenure of pastor, and better relationships leads to less ideologically driven disunity. Any questions about those kind of broad brush conclusions? Oh, thank you. I forgot to turn that off. Sorry, hopefully they would have seen that we had already resumed, but no, thank you. Thank you. And I even have this over here to show. And if you're looking at it, it's like 30 seconds delayed. Oh, he did. Oh, okay. Thank you, David Poole, for correcting my mistake from hours away. All right, so let's move on. And this is going to be kind of the bulk of the rest of our time. And I hope that we can have some questions and discussion even as we think about this, which is how do we address ideologically driven disunity? So as pastors and church leaders, what do we do about this? I think it's clear to see that it's prevalent. We can see it's worsened by events. We can see that it's present in churches with different factors, different sizes, different sociologies, that it's in a wide range of environments. And that a lot of what we have done has not helped. And that was borne out just in even asking, here are some different things and things like that. Preaching on worldviews, preaching on the mission of the church, preaching on this, debating, posting on social media. There really was no clear pattern or correlation as to the efficacy of any of those. And I would contend, even from not so much the quantitative data, although that really showed that a lot of what we're doing is not having effect, but in some of the qualitative data, the interviews and focus groups, that some of what we've done has made it worse. And if that's the case, then I think we may need to adjust what we are doing and change the way that we're thinking about how we do that. And so hopefully these next thoughts can give you some ideas as to how to do this. A lot of these are going to be principles and not steps, because I don't pastor your church. I don't sit with your elders. So I can't tell you, here's what you need to do. If you do A, B, C, D, and E, you'll have no more disunity. And if I could do that, man, I would be a rich guy because I'd go around the country and I'd sell that to as many people as I could. But I think there are some principles as to how we lead and how we interact with people that if we will incorporate those, we will be much better off. And IDD will be lessened, its presence and its impact. The first broad principle is that we have to listen to a third voice. We have to be able to listen to a third voice. If my ideology is foundational, and it's at the core of who I am, and Tony's ideology is foundational, it's core to who he is, we probably are not going to be able to debate each other off of that. Because I'm not going to change that much. I've already been changed by Jesus. He's redeemed me, he's rescued me. But a lot of who I am is still in here. And if I'm not changing much and Tony isn't going to change much, we cannot debate each other into unity. In fact, I'm not even certain that should be our goal, is to debate each other and convince each other of the rightness or wrongness of our ideologies. Stanley Hauerwas wrote, again, that conflict is part and parcel of Christian unity, means that the unity of a church is not based on agreements, but rather one that assumes that disagreement should not lead to division, but rather should be a testimony to the existence of a reconciling people. That we do have differences, and it's okay that we have differences. Now, there are boundaries and there are bounds, and we need to be clear about that, and that is largely the role of an elder group or a church leadership group, whatever form that takes in your church, that you can say, here's who we are, and if you fall outside of this bound, that you are not part of us. So one, we have to admit and actually be okay with the fact that even a doctrinal statement is in essence a dividing statement. We always want to say, well, this is how we have unity. That's not necessarily how you have unity. It is really a dividing line between who is a part and who is not. And we just have to understand that and recognize it and live within those bounds. But within the bounds of a doctrinal statement, we should be able to have ideological differences and have discussions about those without dividing and without being divisive. The only way that we can do that, I am convinced, because Tony's not going to change and I'm not going to change. And I can tell you that because I tried to change Tony for years, and it was fool's errand right there. But the only way that we can do that is listen to a third voice that transcends both of ours. And that voice is the voice of Jesus. That if we can find the voice of Jesus in the noise, we can have a unity that is not based on ideology. It's tough. And again, I will come back to this over and over. It is hard because there is this relationship between ideology and theology. There's this relationship between ideology and spirituality that is difficult for us to understand and to help our church people understand. But one of the only ways that we have possible to address ideologically driven disunity in our congregation is to be able to continually point people to the voice of Jesus. And I would contend to continually point them to the voice of Jesus in the command of the Great Commission. Now, I can tell some of you are thinking, yeah, we do that. We'll get to that later, because there are times where it doesn't work. And there's still disunity and there's still people who leave. We need to understand that. But we will never be able to all get onto the same page together, ideologically. We have to be okay with that. We have to be okay with that as we lead our churches in focusing on the voice of Jesus in the Great Commission. Second big principle is that we have to consider our part. Have you noticed that you don't have an accent?
I've noticed that.
You know, for the most part, that's just the way you grew up talking. The only reason you know you have an accent is because you moved to Wyoming and everybody, when you lived in West Virginia, people are like, man, you talk funny. You know, you don't recognize your own accent. In fact, Henry Cloud, a psychologist, during the pandemic, he was like, what can I do to help? And he had a free call-in show on Facebook. Lori watched it every week. And people would call in, and you know, Henry's from the South, and someone would call from the South, and Henry would say, at last, someone who doesn't have an accent. Like everybody else sounded exactly like me. You don't realize you have an accent. And in the same way, you may not recognize that you have an ideology. Because it's simply the way that you view the world. And not only that, but as one pastor put it, my ideology is right. Because if I didn't think that, if I thought it was wrong, I would think something different. And so you're convinced of the rightness of your ideology, even though you don't even really recognize that you have one. Which means that there are times where when you come into an ideological tension, you actually speak out of the ideology that you're not recognizing, which can inflame the issue rather than help the issue subside. And so I think one of the things that as pastors and church leaders we need to do, as pastors and church leaders we really need to do, is to ask ourselves some serious questions. One, how have I contributed to the situation? What have I done? What have I said that is actually making this worse? How have I contributed to this situation? Am I more concerned with my own stance than with finding unity? Again, we come back to this fact that theology and ideology, spirituality and ideology often bump up against each other, sometimes even stack up on top of each other. And we think that we are standing on a biblical issue or a theological issue or spiritual issue, when in reality, we're standing on an ideological issue. Even though it may be the same, we have to really consider what we are resting on. Because when we respond out of theology, we can respond in love. When we respond out of ideology, we respond more out of fear, which we'll get into in a moment. Here's a really good question to ask yourself. Am I having more spiritual conversations or political conversations? I think that one question may unlock a lot of what you're facing. I was sitting with one of our participants, not doing an interview, not doing anything. I was just preaching at his church, and so he took us out for lunch. And we're having conversation about this, and he kept pushing back and saying, well, someone's got to stand up for what's right, and we got to do this, and you know, we got to stand for this political thing, because if we don't do this, and nobody else, if the church doesn't stand, who will? And I simply said, well, I'm worried that I have a lot more ideological discussions than spiritual discussions. And he literally sat back in his chair. And I was like, I have nothing to say to that. Because that's where he was living. And that one question can help you determine where you're speaking from. Are you speaking out of your ideology or speaking out of your theology? Even though there's overlap. And I keep coming back to that. We got to be clear. I'm not saying there's not biblical truth. I'm not saying there's no absolute truth. I'm not a relativist. I'm not a postmodernist. I'm not any of those things that you all are about to accuse me of being. I'm not any of those. But we do need to be honest about where we are speaking and what is built upon what. You ask yourself, am I confusing ideology and spirituality? Am I actually guilty of that? See, it's easy to see in someone else. It's easy to see because you got an email. It's easy to see because you got grabbed in the lobby after you preached and it wasn't a strong enough stance. But it's easy to see in someone else, but it's really difficult to see in yourself. And then is the Great Commission's charge to make disciples of Jesus more important than making disciples of my ideology? What is at the core of who you are? See, as church leaders, you're the one who's called, ordained by God to lead your congregation. And where you lead from will play a huge role into how you lead those God has entrusted to you. And so it's imperative that we take some time to really reflect on what am I speaking out of and get that right. Because without it, you're going to continue to have ideologically driven disunity and be impacted by it and be one of those 73% of pastors who said it's causing me stress, and be one of the 80% in the Gallup poll who said I'm seriously considering just leaving ministry. All those things are true. And in a lot of regards, I think it's caused beginning in here. So before we move on, any questions? And as I'm saying that, David, I see your thought on YouTube here, and we're actually getting to that in the next section. So don't worry, I'm not ignoring you. Any questions or comments? All right. The next step. So first is listening to the third voice. Next is considering our part. Third, I think we have to understand the real cause of ideologically driven disunity. And I've mentioned it a couple of times. It appears when you're in the midst of an ideological disunity, a situation where you're having a conversation that's just gone sideways, you don't know how to get out of it, a situation in your congregation, it appears to have an intellectual, a spiritual, or a personal cause. That somebody simply doesn't have the right information. That if they had the right information, that we could change their mind. Sometimes you think, man, that guy is just so stubborn. They're never going to change. You think that they're arrogant, that they think that they just know it all. And it's easy to assign all of these causes to ideologically driven disunity. But through what I've read and what I've heard, what I'm convinced of is that the root cause of ideologically driven disunity is fear. And it's a fear of two things. One, it's the fear of loss. Either losing what we have, or the fear or regret of losing what we once had. So for example, have you heard anyone say something along the lines of, the United States isn't as Christian as it once was? Okay. Someone maybe who's a little older in your congregation, They've had an experience, back in the 50s, and like most people went to church on Sunday. There was a base level of respect for people of faith. Like if you said, "Oh yeah, I go to church," "Oh yeah, well that's great. I go to church too." There's this level of respect for Christianity. There was an outward appearance of Christianity. And they remember that and they say, the United States is not as Christian as it once was. What does that mean, realistically? It means that the United States doesn't have the same expressions that it once was, which to a large extent, were actually more cultural expressions than spiritual expressions. To put it into a modern context, a guy at the last presentation said, "Yeah, I was talking with a friend. We lived in Texas together, and he told me he was moving to Huntington Beach, California." I was like, "Why in the world would you move to Huntington Beach?" And they were in ministry together. He said, "Why would you move to Huntington Beach?" And my friend said, "Because at least I can tell who the heathens are." Because in their context, it was like everybody went to church, everyone was Christian. And so when someone says the United States isn't as Christian as it once was, what they really are talking about is an expression. And I would contend those expressions are much more about conservative ideology than even necessarily spiritual expressions. Again, they bump up against each other. So some of the issues that we're seeing in sexual identity, gender, all those conversations that you're having where you're thinking, man, I can't believe we're talking about this. You think back to, I was here as the pastor in 2015 when the Supreme Court acknowledged gay marriage across the country. And to think of the arc that we've been on from just 2015, I mean, that's not even 10 years ago, to the conversations we're having now, those are a lot of biblical issues. Absolutely. But how many people are actually concerned about the biblical aspect, and how many are concerned about the lack of conservatism and that it's not an expression of that? And so, one, ideologically driven disunity is caused by fear, because people are fearful of either what they have lost or of losing more. Which leads into the second aspect of how ideologically driven disunity is caused by fear, which is it is the fear of the quote unquote other side winning. And that is because ideologically driven discussions almost always devolve into a zero-sum game nature discussion, which means I win and you lose, or I lose and you win. And I just have to tell you, I hate to lose. I am competitive. And if you wonder how competitive I am, I'm going to tell you, I am like way more competitive than you. I mean, I don't want to lose. And even more so, I don't want to lose on these things that are foundational to me. And so when I get into a discussion that bumps up against ideology, I'm going to fight because I am afraid of my side losing and the other side winning. Again, Mark Laberton wrote about this and the confluence of conservatism, even particularly with among conservatives, but ideological discussion and fear and the way we talk about these things. Mark Laberton wrote, "For many conservative evangelicals, changes in theological understandings, social patterns, and moral norms threaten the instinct to control. The perceived loss of control then spawns the impulse to fight back. It isn't surprising, therefore, that evangelicals have consistently been politically conservative and frequently frame their engagement in politics with the language of apocalypse, fear, and warfare. Because we are afraid that we are going to lose. And when we act out of fear, ideologically driven disunity is the result. So I am convinced, looking at the things that I've read, hearing the pastors that I've talked to, that much of ideologically driven disunity is caused by fear. If that is the case, what is the antidote to fear? The antidote to fear is not courage. When we think the antidote to fear is courage, we are more likely to think we need to take a stand. When we think that way, we actually end up playing into ideologically driven disunity. Because just as I don't want to lose, the other side doesn't want to lose either. And so if I take a stand, then it's going to inflame their desire to win. And the result is greater disunity. And so I would contend that just as John writes in 1 John chapter 4, 1 John chapter 4 is a chapter where John is talking about the love of God for us and then equating God's love for us with our love for each other. And in the midst of that, what does John write? Perfect love casts out fear. We come back to the fact that where relationships are stronger, ideologically driven disunity is weaker. And so, love is much more effective than debate. A guy in my church, he was one of those guys. You probably have one or two in your congregation. You get emails from them all the time. And they're just never happy with what you're doing. Always think you're making the wrong decision. I got over and over. And man, some of them were super harsh. And I would think, how am I going to deal with this? What am I going to do? And I'd lose a little sleep about it. And then I'd wake up in the morning, and the very first thing I would wake up thinking was about this guy. I'm like, Lori's right here. What am I doing thinking about him? I mean, it was, that individual. We went round and round. Theological issues, leadership issues, style of ministry issues, philosophy of ministry issues, over and over and over. But I actually never felt like we had disunity. Partly because he knew that I sat with him for 3.5 hours in a operating room waiting room while his wife was having emergency surgery. He knew that I loved him. I think he knew I couldn't stand him. But he knew that I would be there for him. Where relationships are stronger and love is present, IDD is weaker. And so, when your initial response is to debate or to take a stand, take a step back, maybe, and remember that IDD is not caused because someone doesn't have the right information. It doesn't come because they're stubborn and obstinate. It comes because there's fear there. And if we want to address fear, the best way we can do that is through love. As we'll see as we dive into the next section, relationships are critically important. And David Poole wrote, it seems like trust is an important consequence of tenure in relationships. And that's absolutely true. Like the more we can be present, the more we can spend time with, the more trust we have. The more trust we have, the more we're able to have these conversations that lead to better places rather than to ideologically driven disunity. David, I'll try to get to your next comment in a moment because it's absolutely true. Any questions about that? I went on for a little bit there, sorry. Any questions? Okay. The next, before we go on, let me just read what David says. David says, however, it does seem clear that moral relativism and postmodernism has settled into our society with some clear secular implications. And yes, that's absolutely true. And it's not that we can't address those issues. We do have to teach about absolute truth. We have to teach that there's right and wrong. We have to teach that there are clear theological implications for decisions. The real crux of the matter is, how are we doing that? Are we doing it in a way that's going to reduce the temperature in the conversation or to raise the temperature in the conversation and make things worse? And that is where the next step, I think, really comes into play. And this comes from the most frustrating point of my whole doctoral journey. So I'm doing my doctorate through Liberty. I've been working on it since early 2020. And I was flying through my doctorate. I was cruising and I understood everything. I was excelling. I doubled up on classes when I didn't need to. Like the first term, I signed up for 2 classes because I was like, well, I guess I signed up for 2 classes. And then I opened the first website, because it's all online, and it says in the introduction to the class, these classes are designed to take 1 at a time. I was like, oh no! So I stuck with it. I took those 2 classes, and then I was like, well, I managed that. So I took 2 more the next time. My lowest grade of any assignment was a 94. Everything was, 99, 98. Very few of them would give 100. I think just because they didn't want to give out 100. I'm like, no, I deserve 100. I'm complaining to the president. But anyways, I'm like flying through my program. And then I get into the chunk where you're starting to write the thesis. And I write the introduction, ministry context, the problem, the thesis statement, all of these, and move through that. The literature review, you read all these books and you see how they're all interacting together, the theoretical foundations, the theological foundations. And then I get to chapter 3, which is the methodology. How are we going to address it? And in this class, it was biggest chunk. It was like 300 points out of the 1,100 points for the class. And I type it all up. It's beautiful. It's long. It encompasses everything. It's formatted correctly. I submit it, and I got a 78%. And my prof said, well, before I tell you what I said, I have to tell you it really stung. Like what he wrote, it hurt. And part of the reason that it hurt was because it was 100% accurate. And he said, so according to your methodology, all you want is for pastors to preach about common passages and hold a prayer evening. Yeah, that's what I wrote. So I had to take a step back and kind of reevaluate everything that I was thinking as to how to address ideologically driven disunity. And it was frustrating. It was hard. It was difficult, partly because, and this goes back to that whole competitive nature. So I'm competitive with other people. I'm competitive with myself. That one grade knocked me off my 4.0. So I'm going to graduate with a 3.95, and it drives me nuts, all because I didn't think through how to do this well. So I started trying to think through how can we actually do this? What is it about relationships and understanding it and understanding how to navigate them? What can we bring that is of value to the stakeholders, to you all? And as I thought about it and prayed about it and looked at some more resources, I remembered a book that I had read, which was not written by a believer, but I think some of the principles here can really help church leaders address ideologically driven disunity. And the book it's a fabulous book, highly recommend it, The Infinite Game by Simon Sinek. Simon Sinek is a well-known leadership writer. He's spoken at the Willow Creek Leadership Summit several times. Really great stuff. And a lot of times when you read it, you just are reading it assuming he's a Christian, because he's talking about humility. Leaders eat last. Really great book about humility and leadership. Start with Why, a book about thinking about the foundation of who we are and why we exist, and then making all of our decisions based upon that. For the church, it's the Start with Why. Start with the Great Commission and figure out how you're fulfilling that. I mean, it's really great stuff. The Infinite Game was actually really, really important. And so one of the ways that we can address ideologically driven disunity is through playing the infinite game. Now, I want to unpack some of the thoughts of the infinite game for you. First is Simon Sinek. He's writing about the ways individuals or organizations interact with each other or with their environment around them. And he delineates between the finite game and the infinite game. He says a finite game has known players, fixed rules, and an agreed upon objective. And so one of the things that is easy to see in the finite game is sports, right? So you have two basketball teams, you know who's on the floor. These 5 guys are on the floor. If a 6th guy comes on the floor, you get a technical foul. He's not supposed to be there. So they're known players. There are fixed rules. Here's double dribble, here's traveling, here's how you have to play, here's inbounds, here's out of bounds, and there's a fixed objective. If you take this round thing and you put it through that round thing more than the other team puts it through that round thing, then you win. There's known players, there's fixed rules, and an agreed upon objective. Sinek contrasts that with the infinite game, which has known and unknown players. You may not know everybody who's speaking into this conversation. You think you're having a dialogue with one person, but you actually have a lot of other voices that are speaking into that. There are no exact rules. So how are we going to navigate all of this? And then lastly, there's an infinite objective, that the only objective ultimately is to continue playing the game. So Sinek uses as a broad brush illustration right at the beginning the Vietnam War. Vietnam War, if you look at the Vietnam War, by a lot of measurable objectives or measurable metrics, the United States won. We caused more casualties. We had better equipment. We had better strategies. I mean, over and over, you can say, here's how we did this better. The North Vietnamese, however, did things differently. And he points specifically to the Tet Offensive. For some people, you may not realize that Tet is actually a major Vietnamese holiday. And so our military leaders assumed you don't attack on Tet. It's like attacking on Christmas. No one does that. And we all remember when in World War I, you had the trenches and you had the Germans over here and the Americans and the Brits over here, and it was Christmas Eve, so they all stopped fighting and sang Silent Night together, and they came out and hugged each other, and then they went back in their trenches and they fought. But you don't fight then because it's this major holiday. Well, that was known players, fixed rules, and an agreed upon objective. The North Vietnamese, however, were playing the infinite game, and they said, doesn't matter, we'll attack on Tet. And they launched this major offensive that caused a lot of damage. Their only objective was not even necessarily to win the war, but it was to continue playing the game, to stay alive, to keep going. And so Sinek talks about these two different ways to approach a situation, a life, a conversation, an interaction. He's writing largely from a business point of view, so he writes a lot about Apple and the way that they play the game, and he points to them as an example of playing the infinite game versus Microsoft, who played the finite game. And so he identifies 5 characteristics of the infinite game, which I think if we will adapt these more in the way that we lead our church, we will have less ideologically driven disunity. The first of those is that an infinite game advances a just cause. Infinite game advances a just cause. The church of Jesus Christ has the ultimate just cause. It has the just cause of glorifying God through fulfilling the Great Commission command to make disciples. That is the ultimate just cause. There were several pastors in the interview and in the focus group who pointed to this factor of being able to reinforce we are about fulfilling the Great Commission, and here is how we are doing it in this congregation. They pointed to that as to either the diminished impact of IDD or even the lack of IDD, even during COVID, as they were able to keep a church focused on the Great Commission. Secondly, and David, this will come back to some of what you wrote about trust and relationships. A second characteristic of playing the infinite game is that you build trusting teams. You build trusting teams. The importance of relationships cannot be overstated, especially within your leadership group. One of my favorite things that one of the pastors in the focus group said, he just asked a question, what is the best thing that you did? Like, what did you do that helped reduce IDD? And he said, we have, as a leadership group, as elders, we have a lot of preemptory conversations. And he said, we do that in the context of an every other week dinner. So their elders, every other week, just sit down for a meal together. And there's no business that takes place there. But he said, we have really hard conversations. So we'll talk about cultural issues. We'll talk about theological issues that the church in general is facing. And we really hammer this out. And he said, we have a diverse group of leaders in our church. On their leadership team, they have one individual who is a tenured professor at a university, and they have the owner of a gun shop. He's like, and we sit down and we have these conversations, and we trust each other, and we love each other, and we support each other. And we have, even though we've got these two, like they don't see, even politically on some big issues, they don't see things the same way. But there's no disunity there because they've gone through the work of building a trusting team, of developing relationships, and in the context of building those relationships, having the hard and tough theological and cultural discussions. So those preemptory conversations set the stage for their church to handle disunity in the congregation because the leadership knew they had each other's backs and they had practiced having hard conversations. And that was, he pointed, when I asked the question, I think he was the first one who raised his hand, said, this is what helped us the most, building trusting teams. Third characteristic of an infinite game is study your worthy rivals. Sinek, again, he focuses on business, and so I've adapted some of his thoughts for this discussion because it's not totally analogous. Because I think to myself, well, we don't have rivals, Well, we kind of do because we're talking about disunity. So there is that aspect as well. But there are two things that I think we need to do as we think about those that we are having disagreements with. First, if you're having an ideological discussion that has a potential to tip into the source of disunity, I would encourage you to look for a way that you can admire or affirm something that they do. Sometimes it's really hard, and I hate the example I'm about to give because I know it's going to make someone mad. But we have to realize that regardless of an ideological view that someone has, there's always something that we can point to say, I appreciate that. And partly I say that. It's the end of the book of Judges. So end of the book of Judges, what was happening? There's chaos, right? And we think there was chaos because everybody was doing what they wanted to do. But that's not what it says. What does it say? Everybody was doing what was right in their own eyes. Why were they doing it? Not because it's just what they wanted to do. They were doing it because they thought it was right. And so even people who have an ideological view that I would say borders on abhorrent, in their heart, they're doing it because they think that it's right. So for instance, and here's where I'm going to make someone mad. Having a conversation with someone who is very pro-choice. As a conservative, yes. Christian, yes. Pastor, yes. I believe abortion is wrong. I believe it's murder. I want to be clear on that. But I do think it's possible to say to someone, I really admire your desire to help women. Because a person who holds a pro-choice view isn't doing that simply because they think we ought to be killing babies. They think it's the best way to help a woman. Now, there's further discussion to be had, but the one sentence of, and I really can see that you really want to help women who are in a desperate situation. And I want to do that as well. We can knock the temperature of that conversation down a degree or two so that we can come to a better understanding. But that won't happen if we don't take time to study our worthy rival. It's hard because everything within me wants to follow that phrase up, but you're really a horrible person, which would be absolutely the wrong thing to say. But in every case, for those who are saying we need to talk more about, or who hold a different view than I do in terms of illegal immigration, to be able to say, I really appreciate your desire to help people as they're making a really difficult journey. For those who are writing you in emails and saying, Pastor, you need to take a stand on this issue. It's easy to say, I really appreciate your desire to affect good change in our culture. Then bring the conversation along from there. But in doing that, you're taking a moment and studying your worthy rivals. Fourth, prepare for existential flexibility. I just like that sentence because of all the syllables in a short amount of time. Prepare for existential flexibility. Again, I've adapted this a little bit from what Sinek writes. But one of the pastors that was in our focus group said, when we asked what was the best thing that you learned or the best thing that you did to help address IDD, he said something along the lines of, I'm learning what battles I need to fight. I think there's a case to be made that just about every hill is worth dying on. But maybe it's not worth dying on right now. And being able to understand, like, I'm going to address this because it needs to be addressed right now. But even though I hold this view, maybe I'm going to hold off on having this conversation right now because it's not going to help move things forward. Existential flexibility it's a tricky thing because, again, you get into that whole issue of absolute truth and what's right and what's wrong, and in your ideological or your theological stance. I get all of that, but to really take stock of whether a debate, an issue is important enough to handle right now, and to have the flexibility to say, I'm just going to let that one go for the time being. We'll come back around to it because we're here for a long time, because relationships matter, and I want to be here a long time because IDD is weaker when relationships are stronger, but to have some existential flexibility in the way that we address things. And then lastly, demonstrate the courage to lead. Demonstrate the courage to lead. So I see the previous 4 characteristics really building into the 5th one. So if you have a just cause, it clarifies what we're to do. Trusting teams. If you have a trusting team, it gives you support. There's a little phrase that I think we overlook. 2 little phrases we overlook when Peter stands and he gives his first sermon. He stands and he gives his first sermon. It says that he stands up, he opens his mouth. It says he stands filled with the Holy Spirit, and he stands with the 11. So the other disciples are standing there with him. They have his back. He's empowered by the Spirit of God. He has a trusting team behind him. And so he launches into one of the best first sermons ever. I mean, can you imagine first time you ever preach and 3,000 people come to Jesus? I mean, come on, that's a... Next time, 5,000 people came to Christ. I'm like, wow, Peter, you're getting better. But trusting teams give support. Studying your worthy adversary gives you a tool both to examine your own heart and then also to diffuse a difficult situation. And then existential flexibility can help a church leader understand they don't need to win every debate. And so I am going to give an illustration of maybe how we can do this. And again, I don't want to, because this is a hard conversation. And we have churches in our network who have addressed it in different ways. So I'm going to encourage you to not try to determine right now what's right or what's wrong, but just to think about the process. Because again, a lot of these discussions are context specific. So context of your elders, context of your congregation, you may land on a different position than someone else. And then it's easy to say, well, that's just wrong, so we're not doing that. Which for your context is true. And again, we have biblical truth, and so we understand that. That's all within the context. So this is not to be postmodern or relativistic. But do you use a transgender person's preferred pronouns? I don't know if you've wrestled with that as a church leadership team. If you haven't, you probably oughta. Because it's easy to think that it's a Boulder, Colorado issue. It's not. It's a Milliken, Colorado issue. Which if you know Milliken, you probably don't know Milliken because this is a tiny little farm town. And there's a transgender teacher in their school. And so someone in our church, their kids go to school in Milliken, and they're trying to figure out, how do we handle this? And so it's easy to think this is a big city out there issue. I think you would be wise as a church leadership team, even if you've not faced the issue, to have the conversation right now. Because one, that's a preemptory conversation. You're building trusting teams. You're working through the issue, maybe even outside of the context of having to face the issue. But I think it's crucial to discuss. So do you use it? We have churches in our network that have landed on either side of this discussion. A church that has said, yes, we are using someone's preferred pronouns. And a church has said, no, we are not. So let us walk through these 5 characteristics and see how that might play out. First, advancing a just cause. I would contend that any time you as a leadership team make a decision that is ideological adjacent, right? So this is biblical truth, but someone from outside, what are they seeing? They're thinking in terms of ideology. And so if we are making a decision that's ideology adjacent, we have to be able to connect that decision with the Great Commission. We have to be able to connect it with the Great Commission. And so these 2 churches have approached that in different ways. One church that is using preferred pronouns says, we believe that this is the best way for us to reach teenagers who are in a desperate situation without alienating them. We are going to be welcoming to them so that we can speak Jesus into their life, so that we can help move them along the process of coming to Jesus, learning about Jesus, and looking like Jesus. And we'll get the rest of it figured out as we go along. So that's how that church handled it. The church that says, no, we are not using preferred pronouns. The church that said we are not using preferred pronouns says, we want to help students in their understanding of truth. The way that we are helping them move along the process of discipleship is to help them understand that there is clear delineation between right or wrong, and this is what God says. And so we are taking that stand. Both of them connected to the Great Commission. Both of them very context and philosophy of ministry specific. Both of them looking to see how they can advance a just cause. Both of them have bumped up against some disunity because of that decision, but they are able to navigate that a little better because they are showing how this decision advances our role in fulfilling the Great Commission. Secondly, build trusting teams. Again, if your leadership team has not landed on a way that you're going to address this, then you need to have this conversation. Because even if you're small town, medium-sized town, suburban, super conservative, you will, in the next couple of years, have to have this decision or this conversation. And so you are much better off having it now. Because as you have it now, you're going to build a trusting team. And you're going to build a trusting team and that you know that you have each other's back. And because you may have disagreements on that board, you can wrestle through that. But to do it outside of the context of the stress of the external pressure, and to do it privately. So you as your leadership team need to have this conversation way before there's any public statement or public display of what this decision is. Kevin, do you know what we're talking about? Preferred pronouns, how we handle that. So you came in after I gotten going on it, but I just want to make sure you're up to speed. So we looked at advancing a just cause. How are we advancing the Great Commission in this? Anytime we have an ideology adjacent decision as a board, we have to tie it to the Great Commission. And so for Kevin's benefit, we have a church that has decided to use preferred pronouns in our network and a church that has decided not to. And there may be more on either side. Those are just churches that I know of and that are both in this project. The church has said, yes, we are. It's because they believe it's a way that they can reach youth who are wrestling with the issue, welcoming them, leading them along the road to discipleship. Church that says no is because they believe that's the best way they can communicate the importance of truth. Whether what's right and wrong, we have male and female. They both took time to connect it to their mission of how they're fulfilling the Great Commission. Building trusting teams, you heard that discussion. So, third, existential flexibility. I think both of these leadership teams need to ask themselves some questions. First, for the church that's saying, yes, we are using preferred pronouns, are you actually showing care? Or are you caving to culture? Really wrestle with that. Because it may be that you're just simply caving to culture. You just want to try to pretend that it's not there. If you are saying, no, we are not using preferred pronouns, I think you have to ask yourself the question, are you standing for truth? Really? Or are you promoting an ideology? Again, there's some overlap there. Yes. But what are you speaking out of? Because if you speak out of truth, you can communicate in love. If you speak out of ideology, you're ultimately going to communicate out of fear. And it can exacerbate that ideologically driven disunity. Study your worthy rivals. The church that says, yes, we are going to use preferred pronouns. Have they taken the time to look at what a church who says, no, we are not? What's their reasoning? Who have you read in that? Who have you listened to in that? Who holds a different view? Are there ways in which they actually are fulfilling the Great Commission better than you? The same thing's true if you make the other decision. Have you read, if you decide we are not using preferred pronouns, have you read an author like Preston Sprinkle? I don't know if you're familiar with Preston, but pretty solid guy. And he says, no, we use preferred pronouns because we believe that that shows hospitality and gives us a way to engage with people. You may totally disagree with that. I probably fall in that camp. I just have to tell you, in this regard, I'm glad I'm not a local church pastor because I don't know where I would fall on this. I go back and forth. I'm not certain I agree with Sprinkle on that. But then I also am not certain that I don't. But wrestle with that question. If you say, no, we're not using preferred pronouns, how is Preston Sprinkle better at fulfilling the Great Commission? Is there something you can learn from that? Because maybe it's something that you can adapt and bring in. But the inclination is to just totally reject it whole cloth if they don't hold to your same ideology. Sinek uses this amazing illustration as he talks about studying your worthy rivals. Apple, again, that's really what he lands on when he talks about the infinite game. Apple was just dominating personal computing, and IBM had resisted releasing a PC. They were like, no, that's that's just junk. People don't want computers in their own home. We're not doing that. We're building all these big mainframes that take up buildings, and you have to fill out your little punch cards, and that's what we're doing. And then they realize, ooh, we are missing the boat. And so they launched the first PC. And when they launched their PC, Apple took out a full-page ad in the New York Times saying, IBM, welcome. And then it said, no, seriously, we're glad you're here, because we think that as we compete and work with each other, or work against each other at times, that we all can be better, and that we all can advance the purpose of getting computers into homes and computing into individuals' hands. They were like supreme example of studying your worthy rival. And there are times where I think we need to carefully read people who think things differently than we do, because maybe there are things we can learn from them. So study your worthy rivals. Prepare for existential flexibility. What are maybe things that we need to change? Again, this goes back to, are you actually showing care or caving to culture? Are you actually standing for truth? Or are you promoting your ideology? It may be that you think, yes, this is the way we need to go. And then if you ask yourself that question, you think, oh, no, maybe we weren't getting this right. And so begin to make the change. And then lastly, lead with courage. Lead with courage. There will be bumps along the way. As we'll talk about in just a moment, people will still leave. But if you're committed to advancing your just cause, you have a trusting team beside you, you've done the research to think through what your worthy rivals are saying, you've wrestled with, is this actually the way to go? Then be courageous in the way that you lead, and lead your congregation forward in fulfilling the Great Commission. All right, last thing. I'm tempted to take a break, but then we'll be late. So give me like 15 more minutes. Are we good? All right. I need a drink of water. And then we'll open it up. No, let's open it up for questions right now. Before we go on to this last section. Does anyone have any questions about that? Or any comments? Any stones you want to throw? Yeah, let me grab you the mic here.
Just something I was kind of reflecting on while you're talking, thinking about Christ and how he modeled some of this stuff, and thinking about some of the IDDs that he faced. But then I got to realizing that a lot of the people that were standing in opposition to him, he wasn't in unity with to begin with. And it got me to thinking about, our own churches. Some of the people that we sometimes try to appeal to are not actually part of our church. They may show up every Sunday, but they're not part of our church in that sense. They're not people that we're walking in agreement with. And to have an IDD implies that we at some point can have unity, but we can't have unity with somebody who's not a believer.
Yeah.
And for me, those important to kind of think through, like, because I was thinking about some of the IDDs that maybe exist culturally. People that I, friends, family, whatever that might be, outside of the church. And those are battles that are not worth winning.
Yeah.
In one sense, but
Yep.
the battle of the IDDs within the church is worth winning by working through this stuff. And
Yeah.
but to have disunity, there has to be unity. That was just kind of my reflection, I guess.
Yeah, and realistically, the only way that we have unity, regardless of how adept we are at playing the infinite game, the only way we can have unity is through Jesus. You look at Ephesians 2, Ephesians 4, that God is bringing the disparate things together, and that we are now united in Christ. I mean, there are that is the only source of unity. And as a congregation then, united in Jesus, we need to be united then in fulfilling the mission of the Great Commission, which someone who doesn't know Christ doesn't care about the Great Commission. And so, you're exactly right, Cody. Yeah, thank you. Anything else? All right, let's dive into the last thing, and then maybe Tony will give into temptation. And the last thing. So regardless of how well we are able to address ideologically driven disunity, sometimes it's just not possible to be united. And that can happen for a variety of reasons. But we do need to wrestle with the question, when is it time to move on? So one of the pastors in the focus group said, he put it, when do you know when it's time to pray someone on? I just love the way he put that. When do you pray someone on? And how do you do that? And there are times where we do need to pray someone on. First of all, there are no simple answers. As I said, I think in the presentation notebook, you can start adding all sorts of variables and hypotheticals into the situation. It would be way more than I could write in that book. So there are no simple answers, but there are some principles. So some principles for the when. When do you pray someone on? When do you say, we've had this discussion enough? I've had that a time or two. Actually, the individual that I talked about earlier, who I had email after email from, there was one case where I just literally told him, I can't talk to you about this anymore because this is not going anywhere. How do you know when to do that? And even more importantly, when you're looking at an issue where it's causing disunity in the church because of ideology, when do you know it's time to move on? And I think the best way to gauge is to recognize that you have a finite amount of energy. Your leadership team, you only have so much energy. And what you spend here, you cannot spend here. And so you have to ask yourself the question, as I'm having these discussions with this individual that's inflaming ideologically driven disunity in our congregation, even maybe, if I'm having discussions with him or her, because they both can cause problems, is it a better use of my energy to bring reconciliation in this? Or is my congregation better served spending it here advancing the Great Commission? Another way to look at that is, let's say I spend a ton of energy here on this conversation, and after months, there's a little bit of reconciliation here. Does that movement towards reconciliation empower your congregation more to fulfill the Great Commission? Or would you, leading in a different endeavor, empower your congregation more to fulfill a Great Commission? That's a question for you to answer, a question for you and your leadership team to wrestle with. But if you are spending so much time on this issue or in this relationship that your congregation is hindered in fulfilling the Great Commission, then I would say that's a misuse of your finite amount of energy. And you either need to hand that off to someone else or to bring that conversation to an end. Those are hard conversations to have. And sometimes they're hard because they're long-standing relationships. So one of our pastors in the focus group said the time just after COVID that hurt him the most, they were a larger church. They had I think he said they had like 150 people leave the congregation. And he said, I knew about 100 of them. So I called them all. So he got on the phone. Hey, we miss you. Hey, I understand you've left. Just want you to know we love you. He said the ones that hurt the most, so there were 5 families who left that he had known and been close with for 25 years. And they left without a word. It stings. And there are times where we have these conversations and someone says, no, well, let's come back and do this, and we got to get this right, and we got to do this, and we got to do this. And you realize, you know what? This series of conversations is actually hindering our church's ability to fulfill the Great Commission. I think you have to evaluate, what's your mission? Is your mission to see this relationship restored? That probably isn't going to be after a time. Or to make disciples. Because you have a finite amount of energy and you can't do both. So that's one way to gauge the when, is recognizing you have a finite amount of energy, and at some point you need to be able to say, you know what? I can't do this anymore because it's keeping me from doing that. The how goes back to a little bit studying your worthy rivals. Look for something that you can admire in them. And to be able to say, I can see your desire for righteousness. I can see your desire to stand on truth. I can see your desire to affect change and even cultural change. And I do agree that our culture's off track. I really love your desire to do that. Look for an area of agreement or admiration. And then reinforce the mission of the church. As you're having this discussion and you know that someone's on their way out the door, to say, this is what we're called to do at Grace Point. We are called to fulfill the Great Commission. And this is how we are doing that. And we would love for you to be a part. We would love for you to join us on this journey. Because in addressing it that way, you then put the onus of leaving on them. You're inviting them to join. And if they say, well, what about and this, you say, this is where we're moving. And if you want to join us in this way, then come with us. If they choose to leave, at that point, they've chosen to leave. And as a pastor, that is really hard. I hate it when people leave our church. I hate it for all sorts of reasons. I hate it because I feel like I've lost a battle, like I've not done a good job of shepherding and caring. I hate it because that means our average attendance goes down. I know I have to give a report to the elders the next month. I mean, I hate it for all sorts of reasons, but sometimes people leave. And we have to understand that and actually be okay with it. And lastly, if they want to leave, bless them, pray for them, call them, we love you, be Jesus to them. And I would say most importantly in this, don't chase them. Because personal experience, I have convinced, throughout my years of ministry, I've convinced 3, maybe 4 couples who've left to come back. And they cause way more problems second time around. Because ideologies are foundational. And they haven't changed. And so then, like, I've expended a ton of my finite amount of energy resources to get them to come back. They've come back, and then it's hindered even more our church's ability to fulfill the Great Commission. So how do you pray someone off, and when do you do it? You understand finite amount of energy. You bless them on their way out, and then you serve with the people that you have. And you look to see, how are we, who are committed to the mission of fulfilling the Great Commission here in our context, here in our congregation, how can we do that better and better? And we do it by advancing the just cause, by building trusting teams, by having existential flexibility, by studying our worthy rivals, and by leading with courage and conviction. And as we do that, I think as pastors, church leaders, we will begin more and more to address ideologically driven disunity in our congregations. It's not a quick fix, because there are no quick fixes. We didn't get here quickly, even though it feels like it because of COVID. We didn't get here quickly, but we need to start the process, because the best time to plant a tree, 20 years ago. Second best time, today. So let's be people who lead with courage, who play the infinite game, and who help our congregations fulfill a Great Commission. Any last comments or questions? Brad K came in for like the last 5 minutes.
Came in for the summary. I'm good.
All right, let me pray for us, and then I will get the resources up on the screen. We're gonna skip over this. All right, God, thank you for calling us to such an important task of leading your people in fulfilling what you've called them to do. And God, man, I just grieve over the conversations that I've had with pastors who have been stressed, have been in some cases broken because of disunity that has come about in their congregation because of outside influences. And so I pray that as people who are entrusted with the heavy responsibility of shepherding your people, God, I pray that you would help us to do that well, to do it compassionately, to do it with conviction, most importantly, to do it in a way that honors and glorifies you as we make disciples of all nations. Seeing people come to Jesus, seeing people learn about Jesus, and seeing people live like Jesus. Father, for the guys in the room, for the people who are watching online, God, I pray that you would give us the great hope that we have because of Jesus, because of the Spirit that dwells within us, because of your call on our life. And that as we have hope and courage, God, that we would do a better job of honoring you. Father, for someone in our region who is in the thick of a difficult ideological discussion, God, I pray that you would give them an understanding of how to do that with grace and with love and with courage. God, thanks for the people who've traveled. We pray that as they head back, that you would give them safety and that you would help us to rejoice in all that you're doing in us. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. This is the project website. If you go there, there will be the presentation notebook, the devotional you can get access to there, either a PDF version that's online or there's some links to Amazon. There are the Unity Covenant is up there. Next Friday, there will be 3 sermon series that if you desire to use, you can use that. And then lastly, I just want to remind you as church leaders that we are here for you, that we love you guys. We want to support you in whatever way we can, that either myself or one of our board members or one of our regional care pastors are here to support and encourage you, to pray for you. If I can come and sit down and talk with your leadership team, just about any issue. I actually, one of the things that I've loved over the last couple of months is, or I guess it's longer than that now, maybe 5 months, I've sat with 2 different elder groups who've been really wrestling with a difficult conversation they needed to have with someone in their church, and were uncertain as how to do that. And it was a real blessing to be able to come alongside of them and just coach them through that. I didn't tell them exactly what to do, but just kind of help them walk through that situation. And if we can do that, we'd love to. If you need someone to preach, I'd love to show up and preach and love on your congregation as well. So, last resource to keep in mind, September 11th and 12th, our leadership retreat, Estes Park, Colorado. Ed Stetzer speaking. Really looking forward to having him and getting our churches from across the region together. So plan on that. Other than that, thank you for coming. Thank you so much for you guys who came, who are not a part of the project. For those who've been a part of the project, thank you for your help in this process, because I literally could not have done it without you all. And looking forward to getting the rest of the results out to you. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks, John.
Drive safely. Thank you. Thank you. David, you're on that camera. And the rest of you who are watching, thanks for joining us online. If you have any questions, you can text me. You can send me an email at john@rmcn.org. Thank you.